Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The House of Shadows. I'm 21 years old now. But this story began when I was just 9 years old, living in a house that seemed to breathe with unseen presence. My uncle stayed with us during that time, occupying the guest room on the second floor of our old colonial home. He wasn't really my uncle by blood, but rather my father's cousin who had fallen on hard times and needed a place to stay while he got back on his feet. We welcomed him with open arms, never suspecting that his presence would unveil the darker secrets our house had been keeping. Our home sat at the very beginning of Maple Street, a distinction that seemed insignificant at the time but would later prove to be important. It was the first house ever built on our street, constructed in 1952 when the neighborhood was nothing but farmland and wild grass. The previous owners had lived there for 40 years before selling it to my parents, and they'd mentioned strange occurrences only in passing, with nervous laughs and quick subject changes that we should have paid more attention to. My uncle Marcus was a peculiar man who claimed to possess what he called the sight, an ability to perceive things that existed beyond the normal range of human perception. He would often talk about seeing auras around people, sensing energies in rooms, and occasionally catching glimpses of those who had passed on but hadn't quite left our world behind. My parents tolerated these discussions with polite smiles, though I could see my mother's jaw tighten whenever he brought up the subject at dinner. Marcus maintained a rigid routine that never varied. Every morning at precisely 4 o'clock, his alarm would sound, and he would rise to begin his day. He would brew his coffee in the darkness of the early morning, the rich aroma drifting through the house like an announcement of his wakefulness. Then he would perform what he called his morning rounds, checking all the windows and doors, watering the plants on the back porch, and sitting on the front steps to watch the street slowly come to life as dawn approached. The incident that changed everything occurred on a Tuesday morning in late October. The autumn had been particularly cold that year, with frost already forming on the windows despite it being early in the season. Marcus woke at his usual time, the old floorboards creaking under his feet as he made his way from his room toward the stairs. The guest room was positioned right beside the staircase, giving him a clear view of anyone ascending or descending. As he stepped out of his room, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he saw my 17-year-old sister Sarah climbing the stairs. She held a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, the vapor rising like tiny ghosts in the dim hallway light. What struck Marcus as immediately odd was her posture. Her head was bent downward at an unnatural angle, her long brown hair hanging like a curtain that completely obscured her face. "Good morning, Sarah," Marcus called out cheerfully, though something in his chest tightened with an inexplicable unease. "You're up early for a school day. Big test coming up." Sarah continued her slow ascent without acknowledging him. Her feet moved mechanically, each step measured and deliberate, but there was something wrong with the rhythm. It was too perfect, too synchronized, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. She passed within inches of him, close enough that he could smell the coffee, but she never lifted her head, never turned in his direction, never gave any indication that she had heard him speak. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October cold. He watched as Sarah reached the top of the stairs and turned toward her room, her movements fluid yet somehow wrong, like watching a film that had been slowed down just enough to be noticeable. The door to her room opened without her touching the handle. He was sure of it, and she disappeared inside, the door closing with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. Shaking off his discomfort and attributing it to his own grogginess, Marcus descended the stairs to get his own coffee. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove that my mother always left on at night. As he reached for the coffee pot, he froze. Through the doorway to the living room, he could see my mother standing at the ironing board, pressing what appeared to be one of my father's work shirts. The sight of her stopped him cold. My mother was wearing her nightgown, the same pale blue one with tiny flowers that she had worn to bed the night before. He had seen her in it when she had wished him good night at around 10:30, but here she was at 4 in the morning, ironing clothes in near darkness, her movements repetitive and mechanical. "Margaret!" Marcus called out, his voice catching slightly in his throat. "What are you doing up at this hour? Is everything all right?" My mother didn't respond. She continued her ironing with methodical precision, running the iron over the same section of shirt again and again. Her head was tilted downward, just like Sarah's had been, her face hidden in shadow despite the small lamp beside the ironing board providing a pool of yellow light. Marcus took a step closer, his bare feet silent on the cold kitchen tiles. "Margaret, can you hear me? Are you sleepwalking?" Still no response. The iron continued its journey across the fabric with a soft hissing sound, steam rising periodically like small signals of distress. My mother's breathing was so quiet it was almost imperceptible, and Marcus realized with growing horror that he couldn't even see her chest rising and falling. That's when the fear truly took hold. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get away from whatever these things were that looked like his family members but clearly were not. His gift, his sight, was practically burning behind his eyes, showing him shadows where there should be substance, emptiness where there should be life. Marcus backed away slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He reached the stairs and took them two at a time, his heart pounding so hard he was sure it would wake the entire house. He burst into his room, slammed the door behind him, and turned the lock with trembling fingers. For good measure, he dragged his dresser in front of the door, the furniture scraping loudly against the floor. He sat on his bed in the darkness, afraid to turn on the light, afraid to draw attention to himself. Every small sound in the house made him jump, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind against windows, the distant hum of the refrigerator. He pulled his blankets up to his chin like a child and waited for dawn, praying that what he had seen had been some kind of hallucination or waking dream. When morning finally came, real morning, with sunlight streaming through his windows and the sounds of my family preparing for the day, Marcus emerged from his room cautiously. He found my mother in the kitchen making breakfast, humming softly to herself as she scrambled eggs. Sarah sat at the table, textbook open in front of her as she crammed for what was apparently a history test. "Good morning, Uncle Marcus," Sarah said brightly, looking up from her notes. "You're up late today. Are you feeling okay?" Marcus stared at her, searching her face for any sign of wrongness, any indication that she was not who she appeared to be. But this was clearly Sarah, animated, alive, present in a way that the thing on the stairs had not been. "I need to talk to both of you about something," Marcus said slowly, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. "Did either of you get up around 4 this morning?" My mother turned from the stove, spatula in hand, her brow furrowed with concern. 4 in the morning? Heavens, no. I didn't wake up until my alarm went off at 6:30. "Why do you ask?" Sarah shook her head, her expression puzzled. "I was dead asleep until Mom woke me up 20 minutes ago. I was up until midnight studying, so there's no way I got up at 4. Marcus told them what he had seen, watching their faces carefully for their reactions. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to concern to barely concealed skepticism. Sarah looked genuinely frightened, her eyes darting toward the stairs as if expecting to see her doppelganger descending. "It must have been a dream," my mother said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "A very vivid dream. This old house can play tricks on you, especially in the early morning darkness." But Marcus knew what he had seen. His gift had never led him astray before, and the feeling of wrongness that had emanated from those entities, he couldn't think of them as anything else, had been overwhelming. Something in this house was mimicking the family, copying their appearances but unable to fully replicate their essence. That night, Marcus prepared himself. He set up a small camera he had borrowed from a friend who was into photography, positioning it to capture the hallway outside his room. He sprinkled salt across his doorway, an old protection ritual his grandmother had taught him. He kept his bedside lamp on and a flashlight within reach. If the entities returned, he would be ready. At 3:45 in the morning, Marcus was awakened not by his alarm, but by a feeling of intense cold. His breath came out in visible puffs, and frost had formed on the inside of his windows despite the heating being on. He sat up slowly, every nerve on edge, and that's when he saw her. A woman sat at the foot of his bed, her long black hair hanging down to obscure her face. She wore a white nightgown that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She was perfectly still, so motionless that for a moment Marcus wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. "Who are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you want?" The woman's head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Then, with movements that were too fluid to be natural, she stood up. She was tall, taller than any woman should be, her head nearly touching the ceiling. She turned toward Marcus, and though her hair still covered her face, he could feel her watching him. "Leave," Marcus commanded, trying to put authority into his voice despite his terror. "You're not welcome here. Leave this house and don't come back." The woman took a step toward him, then another. Each footfall was silent despite the creaky floorboards that normally announced every movement in the old house. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and switched it on, directing the beam at her face. What he saw in that brief moment before she vanished would haunt him for years. Behind the curtain of hair was not a face but an absence, a void where features should have been, a darkness so complete it seemed to pull light into it. And then she was gone, as if she had never been there at all, leaving only the lingering cold and the sound of Marcus's racing heartbeat. The next morning, Marcus reviewed the camera footage with shaking hands. The hallway had been empty all night. At least, that's what the camera showed. But at exactly 4 o'clock, the timestamp on the footage jumped, skipping ahead 17 minutes. Whatever had happened during those missing minutes, the camera had been unable or unwilling to record it. Marcus stayed with us for another month after that night, but he was never the same. He stopped his early morning routine, instead staying in his room with the door locked until the sun was fully up. He placed protective symbols around his doorway and windows, things he had learned from his grandmother, he said. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I would catch him staring at my mother or Sarah with an expression of deep uncertainty, as if he couldn't quite convince himself they were really who they appeared to be. The thing that disturbed me most, even as a 9-year-old child, was the change in the house itself after Marcus's encounters. It felt different, heavier somehow, as if something had been awakened by his acknowledgement of it. I began to notice things too, shadows that moved independently of their sources, cold spots that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and sometimes, late at night, the sound of footsteps on the stairs when everyone was accounted for in their beds. My parents tried to maintain normalcy, but I could see the strain in their faces. My mother started leaving more lights on at night. My father installed new locks on all the doors, though he couldn't quite explain why he felt it was necessary. And Sarah began sleeping with her door locked, something she had never done before. Years passed, and we eventually moved away from that house on Maple Street. The official reason was that my father had gotten a better job in another state, but I knew the truth. We were fleeing from something that had no name, no form we could definitively identify, but whose presence had become increasingly oppressive. The house still stands there, at the beginning of Maple Street. I drove past it recently, unable to resist the pull of morbid curiosity. There were new owners, a young family with children playing in the yard. I wanted to warn them, to tell them about the things that walked those halls in the early morning darkness, wearing familiar faces but carrying an alien consciousness. But what could I say that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman? Sometimes, in the early morning hours when I can't sleep, I think about Uncle Marcus and what he saw that night. I think about the woman at the foot of his bed and the missing 17 minutes of footage. I think about my mother and sister's doppelgangers, moving through our house with purpose known only to them. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting in the darkness of that old house, copying the faces of its new inhabitants, walking the stairs in the pre-dawn hours when the boundary between our world and theirs grows thin. Marcus never spoke about what happened in that house after he moved out, but he sent me a letter on my 18th birthday. Inside was a single paragraph. The gift of sight is sometimes a curse. There are things that exist alongside us, sharing our spaces, wearing our faces when it suits them. That house on Maple Street is a crossroads, a place where the veil is torn. If you ever have children of your own, promise me you'll teach them to lock their doors at night and to never, ever investigate sounds in the darkness. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I kept that letter, and I've heeded his advice. My own children think I'm overprotective when I insist on checking their room before bedtime, when I place salt on their windowsills and hang protective charms above their doors. They don't understand why I freeze when I hear footsteps in the hallway at night, or why I always call out to make sure it's really them before they enter a room. But I know what I know. I've seen what Marcus saw, felt what he felt. And sometimes, in those liminal hours between night and morning, I swear I can feel them watching. Those things that wear our faces, that walk through our homes like they belong there, mimicking our lives while serving purposes we cannot begin to understand. The terror never fully leaves you once you've experienced something like that. It lives in your bones, surfaces in quiet moments, makes you question every shadow, every unexpected sound, every figure glimpsed in peripheral vision. You learn to live with it, this knowledge that the world is not as solid and safe as most people believe. You develop rituals and protections, little ways of maintaining the illusion of safety. But deep down, you know the truth. They're out there, whatever they are. They're in our houses, wearing our faces, moving through our lives like actors in a play we're not meant to understand. And the most terrifying part is not that they exist, but that they've probably always existed, walking alongside us, copying us, learning from us, for reasons that remain horrifyingly unknown. I still dream about that house sometimes. In my dreams, I'm 9 years old again, standing in that upstairs hallway, watching something that looks like my sister climb the stairs with mechanical precision. In my dreams, I follow her, even though every instinct screams at me to run. I follow her to see where she goes, what she does, what purpose drives these entities that borrow our forms. But I always wake up before I find out. Perhaps that's for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some truths too terrible to comprehend. Marcus learned that lesson the hard way, and he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, never quite trusting that the people around him were really who they appeared to be. The house on Maple Street still calls to me sometimes. I feel its pull like a physical thing, drawing me back to those rooms where reality grew thin and something else leaked through. Part of me wants to go back, to set up cameras and recording equipment, to finally get proof of what we experienced. But the wiser part of me knows that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. So I stay away. I live my life. I protect my family as best I can with salt and symbols and locked doors. And I try not to think about what might be moving through that old house right now, in the dark hours before dawn, wearing the faces of the family that lives there now, climbing their stairs with perfect mechanical precision, serving purposes that human minds were never meant to understand. But sometimes, despite my best efforts, I catch myself wondering, what if they're not confined to that house? What if they're everywhere, in every home, walking among us, copying us, learning from us? What if the only difference between that house and every other house is that in that place, for whatever reason, we could see them? These are the thoughts that keep me awake at night, staring at my bedroom door, waiting for morning to come. These are the fears that Marcus's gift awakened in all of us. And these are the questions that will never be answered, because some truths are too terrible for the human mind to bear. The story doesn't end here, though. It continues every night, in every house, in every shadow that moves when it shouldn't, in every footstep heard when everyone is accounted for. It continues in the space between sleeping and waking, where the boundaries blur and things that shouldn't exist reveal themselves to those unfortunate enough to see. Marcus died 5 years ago. The official cause was a heart attack, but I know better. He called me the night before, speaking in rapid, frightened whispers. "They found me," he said. "They remember I could see them. They don't like being seen." The line went dead after that, and when they found him the next morning, his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide open, staring at something no one else could see. I inherited his journals after his death, page after page of encounters, sightings, theories about what these entities might be. He had names for them: the mimics, the hollow ones, the face stealers. He documented patterns in their behavior, times when they were most active, places where the veil was thinnest. It was the work of a lifetime spent trying to understand something fundamentally incomprehensible. The final entry, dated the night before his death, consisted of a single sentence. "They're not copying us to replace us. They're copying us to remember us after we're gone." I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure I want to. But sometimes, when I see my reflection move a fraction of a second after I do, or when I catch a glimpse of someone I know in a place they couldn't possibly be, I think about those words. I think about entities that exist outside our understanding of time and space, collecting our faces and mannerisms like photographs, preserving them for reasons we cannot fathom. The protection rituals Marcus taught me have become second nature now. Salt on the windowsills, iron above the doors, mirrors positioned to reflect the corners where shadows gather. My children think these are just quirky decorating choices, and I let them believe that. Ignorance, in this case, truly is bliss. But I know the truth. I know that we share this world with things that wear our faces, that move through our homes in the dark hours before dawn, that exist in the spaces between what we see and what we understand. I know that the house on Maple Street was just one place where the veil wore thin enough for us to glimpse them, but they're everywhere, always have been, always will be. And on quiet nights, when the world is still and the darkness presses close, I can feel them watching, not with malevolence, exactly, but with a kind of cold curiosity, the way a scientist might observe specimens in a jar. We are interesting to them, worth copying, worth remembering. But for what purpose, and to what end, remains a mystery that Marcus took to his grave. This is my inheritance, then, not just the knowledge of their existence, but the burden of seeing, of knowing, of never being able to fully trust that the world is as it appears. Every person I meet could be one of them. Every shadow could hide their presence. Every sound in the night could herald their approach. And the most terrifying part? I'm starting to think they want us to know they're there. Why else would they allow themselves to be seen, even briefly? Why else would they leave traces of their presence? The cold spots, the moving shadows, the footsteps in empty hallways. Perhaps Marcus was wrong. Perhaps they do want to be seen, but only by certain people, at certain times, for reasons that remain frustratingly opaque. I've considered moving far away, starting fresh somewhere new. But I know it wouldn't matter. They're everywhere, these things that wear our faces. The house on Maple Street was just where I first became aware of them. Running would be pointless. So I stay. I watch. I protect my family as best I can. And I document everything, just as Marcus did, hoping that someday someone will piece together the puzzle, will understand what these entities are and what they want from us. Until then, I live with the knowledge that we are not alone, have never been alone, will never be alone. They walk among us, wearing our faces, moving through our lives, copying our every gesture and word for purposes beyond our comprehension. And in the dark hours before dawn, when the veil grows thin and the boundaries blur, they reveal themselves to those who have the gift or curse of sight. This is my story, my burden, my inheritance from Uncle Marcus. And now, having shared it with you, it becomes yours as well. The next time you hear footsteps in an empty house, or see a shadow move independently of its source, or catch a glimpse of someone you know in an impossible place, remember this story. Remember that we are not alone, that we share this world with entities that exist beyond our understanding, that wear our faces and walk through our lives for reasons we may never comprehend. Sleep well, if you can. Lock your doors. Place salt on your windowsills. And whatever you do, if you wake in the early morning hours and see someone you know moving through your house with mechanical precision, their face hidden, their movements too perfect to be natural, don't follow them. Don't speak to them. Don't acknowledge their presence. Because once they know you can see them, really see them, they never forget. And as Uncle Marcus learned, being seen by them, being known by them, being remembered by them, is a fate worse than any nightmare your mind could conjure. The house on Maple Street still stands. The family that lives there now seems happy, oblivious to what shares their home. But sometimes, when I drive past in the early morning hours, I see lights in windows that should be dark, shadows moving behind curtains in rooms that should be empty. And I know that they're still there, those things that wear our faces, continuing their incomprehensible purpose, copying and remembering, waiting in the darkness for the next person gifted or cursed with a sight to discover them. This is where my story ends, but theirs continues. It continues in every house, in every shadow, in every moment between sleeping and waking. They are there, always there, wearing our faces, living our lives in parallel, serving purposes we cannot understand. And now that you know they exist, now that you've heard this story, you might start to see them too. That movement in your peripheral vision that you've always dismissed as imagination, that sound in the night that you've always attributed to the house settling, that feeling of being watched when you're alone, maybe it's nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, you're beginning to see what Marcus saw, what I see, what cannot be unseen once the veil has been lifted. Welcome to the truth. Welcome to the knowledge that we share this world with things beyond our understanding. Welcome to a life of salt circles and iron talismans, of locked doors and sleepless nights, of never quite trusting that the people around you are really who they appear to be. This is Uncle Marcus's legacy, passed down to me, and now to you. Use it wisely. Protect yourself. And remember, they're always watching, always copying, always remembering, for reasons we may never understand. The house on Maple Street is just the beginning. They're everywhere. And now that you know, you'll never be able to forget. The April Fool's night that went wrong. It was a cool spring evening on April 1st, 2001, and I remember sitting in my favorite leather armchair in the living room, completely absorbed in a late-night television program. The house felt peaceful and quiet, with only the soft glow of the TV screen illuminating the darkness around me. I had always enjoyed these solitary moments, especially after long days at work, when I could finally unwind and let my mind drift away from the stresses of daily life. That tranquil atmosphere was suddenly shattered by a loud, aggressive banging sound that echoed from my back door. The noise was so unexpected and forceful that it made my heart skip a beat, and I immediately felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. My first instinct was to rationalize the situation, telling myself that it was probably just a raccoon or perhaps a stray cat that had knocked over something in my backyard. After all, it was not uncommon for small animals to rummage through garbage cans or bump into outdoor furniture during their nighttime adventures. I tried to refocus my attention on the television, convincing myself that whatever had caused the noise was harmless and would soon disappear on its own. But just as I began to relax again, something happened that would forever change my perspective on what I thought was possible. A whisper, so faint yet unmistakably clear, seemed to float through the air directly into my ear. The words sent an icy chill down my spine as I heard someone say, "I am coming for you." The voice was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was not the kind of sound that travels through walls or windows, but rather something that seemed to materialize from the very air around me. My entire body tensed up as I slowly turned my head, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room remained completely empty. The shadows cast by the television light danced on the walls, but there was no human presence to be found anywhere. Gathering what little courage I could muster, I stood up from my chair and walked toward the back door, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air, scanning the darkness of my backyard with growing anxiety. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly with nervousness. The only response I received was the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Feeling somewhat foolish for letting my imagination run wild, I returned inside and locked the door behind me. But as I turned around to head back to my chair, my blood turned to ice in my veins. Standing in the middle of my living room was a tall figure wearing a pristine white rabbit mask, and in his right hand he held a large kitchen knife that gleamed menacingly under the television light. My survival instincts kicked in immediately, and I sprinted toward the kitchen as fast as my legs could carry me. My hands were shaking violently as I fumbled through the knife drawer, finally grasping a sharp carving knife. With my makeshift weapon in hand, I quickly flipped on all the lights in the kitchen, flooding the area with bright illumination. To my absolute amazement and relief, the mysterious intruder began pulling off his white rabbit mask, revealing the familiar and friendly face of my longtime friend Fred. He burst into laughter, his eyes twinkling with mischief as he shouted, "April Fools!" The tension in my body began to dissolve, and I felt a mixture of relief and annoyance washing over me. "Fred, you nearly gave me a heart attack," I exclaimed, setting down the knife with trembling hands. "How on earth did you manage to get inside my house? And more importantly, how did you whisper in my ear from across the room?" Fred looked at me with genuine confusion, his smile fading slightly as he processed my question. "What do you mean, whisper in your ear? I never whispered anything to you. I just put on the mask, grabbed this fake knife from your kitchen drawer, and waited for you to come back inside." A cold realization began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. If Fred had not been the one whispering those terrifying words, then someone else had been in my house. Someone who was potentially still lurking in the shadows, watching our every move. "Fred, we need to hide right now," I whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "Someone else is in this house with us, and we need to call the police immediately." We quickly found a hiding spot in my bedroom closet, and Fred used his cell phone to dial 911 while I kept watch through a crack in the door. The waiting felt like an eternity, every small sound making us jump with fear. When the police officers finally arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the entire house. What they discovered was far more disturbing than either of us had anticipated. They found a man with long, greasy black hair ransacking my bedroom, stuffing valuable items into a large duffel bag. He was armed with both a pistol and several pocket knives, making him extremely dangerous. The officers later informed us that this individual had escaped from a maximum security prison just 3 days earlier and had been considered highly dangerous to the public. The thought that this escaped convict had been hiding in my house while Fred was playing his prank still sends shivers down my spine. If Fred had not arrived when he did, I might have been alone and defenseless against this dangerous criminal. The man with the glass appetite. This particular incident occurred during my childhood. back when my younger brother and I spent countless hours playing elaborate games of cops and robbers in our backyard. We had an impressive collection of toy guns, especially water guns of all shapes and sizes, and we would often stage dramatic scenarios that lasted well into the evening hours. On this particular night, the sky was clear and filled with twinkling stars, creating the perfect backdrop for our adventure. Armed with our brightest flashlights and our favorite water guns, we decided to pretend we were police officers on an important undercover mission. The time was approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, and we had convinced our parents to let us stay outside a little longer than usual. My brother had invited his best friend from school to join our game, and the three of us were having an absolute blast, running around the yard and creating elaborate storylines for our imaginary police work. The night air was crisp and refreshing, and our laughter echoed through the quiet neighborhood. But our innocent fun came to an abrupt halt when we noticed a tall, dark figure standing motionless at the edge of our property. The man appeared to be watching us intently, and something about his posture and demeanor immediately made us feel uncomfortable and unsafe. For several long moments, we simply stared at this mysterious stranger, unsure of what to do or how to react. The silence stretched on until the man suddenly spoke, his voice carrying an unsettling tone that made my skin crawl. "Hey there, kids," he called out. "Can I play with you?" My brother, always the braver of the two of us, responded with a firm, "No, thank you, mister. You should probably go home now." What happened next will be forever burned into my memory. The tall stranger began to contort his body into an unnatural position, bending and twisting in ways that seemed physically impossible. His face transformed into a grotesque smile that was far too wide and menacing for any normal human expression. Fear began to course through my veins, but I tried to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. I raised my toy gun and pointed it in the man's direction, hoping that this small act of defiance might encourage him to leave us alone. As I activated my flashlight to get a better look at his face, what I saw nearly caused me to collapse from sheer terror. Carved deep into the center of his forehead was a large, crude letter X, as if someone had used a knife to etch it into his flesh. But even more horrifying than this disturbing marking was what he was doing with his mouth. The man was actually eating pieces of broken glass, crunching them between his teeth as if they were candy. Blood was streaming down his chin and dripping onto his shirt, but he seemed completely oblivious to the pain or damage he was causing to himself. We had no idea how to process what we were witnessing. This was beyond anything we had ever encountered or even imagined in our worst nightmares. Without saying a word to each other, all three of us turned and ran toward the house as fast as our legs could carry us. My brother's friend was so terrified that he jumped over our fence and disappeared into the night, running toward his own home without looking back. My brother and I made it to the living room window, where we crouched down and tried to catch our breath while keeping watch on the backyard. "Call Mom and Dad right now," my brother whispered urgently, his voice shaking with fear. I grabbed the phone and dialed my mother's cell phone number, but just as she answered, we heard the sound of breaking glass coming from the front of the house. Someone was trying to force their way inside through the large window next to our front door. My brother immediately grabbed my shirt and pulled me toward the staircase, and we quietly made our way upstairs, trying our best not to make any noise that might alert the intruder to our location. We huddled together in my parents' bedroom, holding our breath and straining to listen for any sounds coming from downstairs. For what felt like an eternity, everything remained silent. But then we heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps slowly making their way up the stairs, each step bringing the unknown threat closer to our hiding place. I was about to peek around the corner to see what was happening when we heard the distinct sound of a gun being loaded. The metallic clicking noise filled the air, and we knew that our lives were in immediate danger. My brother, displaying more courage than I knew he possessed, suddenly jumped up and punched the intruder as hard as he could. I heard a grunt of surprise and pain, followed by the sound of someone stumbling backward. We seized this opportunity to run downstairs and head for the front door. our hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Just as we reached the bottom of the stairs, a gunshot rang out behind us, the sound echoing through the house like thunder. We burst through the front door and ran as fast as we could to the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on their door and begging for help. The neighbors immediately called both our parents and the police. When the officers arrived at our house, they discovered a trail of fresh blood leading from the living room all the way to the upstairs bathroom. There, they found the same man we had encountered in the backyard, bleeding heavily and barely conscious. The police later determined that the man had been suffering from a severe mental breakdown and had been living on the streets for several months. Whether he had intended to harm us or was simply seeking help in his own disturbed way, we will never know. But the image of him eating glass with that X carved into his forehead continues to haunt my dreams to this day. The woman in black. I was 11 years old when this terrifying experience changed my life forever. It was the summer of 2015, and my family had decided to take a vacation from our home in Texas to visit relatives in California. Since it was meant to be a relatively short trip, all 6 members of our family stayed together at my aunt's spacious 2-story house. I have always had an irrational fear of multi-story homes, though I could never quite explain why they made me so uncomfortable. There was something about the idea of having spaces both above and below me that filled me with anxiety and unease. On our second night there, my parents decided to attend an adult party that would keep them out quite late. They estimated they would return around 2 o'clock in the morning, which meant my 2 older brothers and I would be left in the care of my 19-year-old cousin for the entire evening. As the evening progressed, we realized that there were no snacks or treats in the house, and my cousin offered to drive to the nearby grocery store to pick up some food and drinks. My brothers, who were only 2 years older than me, eagerly accepted her invitation to come along for the ride. However, I felt a strange reluctance to leave the house. Something deep in my gut told me that I should stay behind, though I could not articulate exactly why I felt this way. When I expressed my desire to remain at the house, my brothers simply shrugged and said they would be back soon. Within 15 minutes of their departure, I found myself completely alone in the large, creaky house. I settled onto the comfortable living room couch with my iPad, trying to distract myself with games and videos. But my entertainment was interrupted by a distinct sound coming from somewhere upstairs. The noise was difficult to describe, but it sounded like furniture being moved or rearranged. My curiosity eventually overcame my caution, and I decided to investigate the source of the disturbance. As I began climbing the wooden staircase, each step seeming to creak louder than the last, a glass cup suddenly came tumbling down the stairs, missing my head by mere inches. Panic immediately set in, and I ran as fast as I could to my uncle's bedroom on the first floor. I dove into the large walk-in closet and pulled the door closed behind me, leaving only a small crack so I could monitor what was happening in the room. Almost immediately after I had hidden myself, the bedroom lights began flashing on and off in a rapid, erratic pattern. The flickering light was visible through the small gap under the closet door, and it created an atmosphere of terror that I had never experienced before. I desperately wanted to text my brother and ask him to come home immediately, but I had left my iPad on the living room couch in my haste to hide. Another sound from upstairs confirmed that whatever was causing these disturbances was definitely located on the second floor of the house. Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I made the decision to run outside and seek help from the neighbors. But before I could execute this plan, I decided to look up at the upstairs windows from the front yard to see if I could spot the source of the mysterious activity. What I saw in that upstairs window will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing perfectly still in one of the bedrooms was the figure of a woman dressed entirely in black clothing. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost ghostly white, and her eyes were completely surrounded by dark, smudged makeup that made her look like she had been crying tears of ink. The woman's appearance was reminiscent of a nun's habit, but there was something deeply unsettling and wrong about her presence. She stood motionless, staring directly down at me with an expression that conveyed both sadness and malevolence. I remained frozen in place for approximately 10 seconds, unable to look away from this terrifying apparition. Just as I was beginning to consider running to the neighbors for help, I saw the headlights of my cousin's car turning into the driveway. When my family members got out of the car, they immediately asked why I was standing outside in the dark. Thinking quickly, I told them that I had wanted to take a photograph of the house from the front yard to capture the beautiful architecture. I did not mention that I had left my iPad inside the house, and thankfully, they did not notice this inconsistency in my story. Once we were all safely inside, I insisted on following my brothers and cousin upstairs, staying close behind them for protection. Nothing unusual happened for the remainder of the evening, and I began to convince myself that perhaps I had imagined the entire incident. But later that night, around 10 o'clock, a thunderstorm began to develop outside. I have always enjoyed watching lightning storms, so I moved the bedroom curtains aside to get a better view of the dramatic sky. As a particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the neighborhood, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. The same woman in black was standing in our neighbor's driveway, directly across the street from our house. She was staring up at the exact window where I was standing, her dark eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Even from that distance, I could see that same unsettling expression on her pale face. That night marked the beginning of a fear that has never truly left me. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder or checking windows before going to sleep. The thought that this mysterious woman might still be out there, searching for me, continues to disrupt my peace of mind and fill my dreams with terror. Story 4. The Stranger in the Shed. This haunting experience occurred when I was approximately 13 years old, during a family vacation that was supposed to be filled with joy and relaxation. My parents, 2 brothers, and half-sister had all decided to take a road trip together, and we had rented a charming cottage in a small, remote village surrounded by towering mountains. The village was incredibly small and peaceful, with probably no more than 20 houses scattered throughout the area. Our cottage was situated next to a beautiful little lake that was large enough for kayaking and other water activities, and the entire property was enclosed by a tall, sturdy fence that provided privacy and security. To the right of the lake stood an old, weathered shed that immediately caught my attention. The structure appeared to have been abandoned for many years, with ivy growing wildly across its walls and roof. The ceiling had obviously been repaired multiple times, but the work appeared to have been done hastily and without much skill. What made the shed particularly intriguing and somewhat unsettling was that its door stood wide open, revealing only darkness within. Given that our rental property was completely fenced off from the outside world, it seemed impossible that anyone could have gained access to the shed without our knowledge. On our second day at the cottage, my 16-year-old brother and I found ourselves with very little to do besides swimming in the cold lake water. Since this trip was taking place during the winter months, darkness would fall much earlier than we were accustomed to, which added an extra element of mystery to our surroundings. Out of curiosity and boredom, we decided to explore the old shed before dinner time. As we walked across the property toward the mysterious structure, we began to notice something strange and unexplainable. There appeared to be a source of light emanating from within the shed, shining through the various cracks and gaps in the deteriorated walls and ceiling. The light did not appear to be coming from any kind of conventional electrical fixture, but rather seemed more like the glow of a torch or lantern. As we drew closer to the shed, we could see this mysterious light moving around inside, as if someone was carrying it from one area to another. Suddenly, without any warning, the light stopped moving and pointed directly at us through one of the larger gaps in the shed wall. The beam was incredibly bright and blinding, making it impossible for us to see anything else in our immediate surroundings. Both my brother and I stood completely frozen in place, staring at each other with expressions of pure terror and disbelief. Our parents were inside the cottage watching television, and the distance between us and the house was far enough that they would never hear us if we called for help. I have always looked up to my older brother as someone who was strong, brave, and capable of handling any difficult situation. But in that moment, I saw his lower lip begin to tremble with fear, and I realized that even he had no idea how to handle what we were experiencing. We remained motionless under the blinding light for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes in reality. Our eyes had become so accustomed to the bright beam that when it was suddenly switched off, we found ourselves unable to see anything in the darkness that followed. In our desperation to escape, we began running toward the cottage, but our light-adjusted eyes made navigation nearly impossible. We stumbled and tripped over obstacles in the yard, making far more noise than we intended. As if our situation could not become any more terrifying, we began to hear shuffling sounds coming from the direction of the shed. The sounds grew progressively louder and more urgent, as if someone or something was moving quickly in our direction. Then, cutting through the night air, we heard a hollow, raspy voice calling out from behind us. Despite every instinct telling me not to look back, I could not resist turning around to see what was pursuing us. Standing next to the shed was a middle-aged man holding a large flashlight in his hands. His hands and arms were covered with what appeared to be fresh blood, and his hair was so greasy and unkempt that it looked like he had not bathed in months or even years. His beard was long, tangled, and matted with various debris. In a voice that sounded like it was coming from the depths of hell itself, he called out to us, "Come here, children. I have many wonderful toys inside this shed. Would you like to play some games with me?" As he spoke these words, his face twisted into the most disturbing and unnatural smile I have ever seen. His eyes were opened unnaturally wide, and he stared at us without blinking, as if he was not entirely human. I screamed as loudly as my lungs would allow, and my brother grabbed my hand with a grip that felt like it might break my fingers. We ran toward the cottage faster than I had ever run in my life, our hearts pounding with terror and adrenaline. When we burst through the front door, we immediately told our parents everything that had happened. At first, they looked at us with skepticism and confusion, clearly having difficulty believing such an incredible and frightening story. But their doubts vanished completely when they looked toward the living room window and saw the man's face pressed against the glass. In his bloody hand, he held a large butcher's knife, and his grotesque smile had been replaced by an expression of pure rage and malice. My parents immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes due to the small size of the town. Unfortunately, by the time the officers reached our property, the man had disappeared back into the shed, and despite an extensive search of the area, they were never able to locate or capture him. During their investigation, the police informed us that a girl matching my description and age had been brutally murdered in a neighboring town just 1 month earlier. The thought of what might have happened to us if we had been slower to escape, or if the police had not arrived so quickly, still fills me with overwhelming dread. Since that terrifying night, I have been unable to approach any kind of shed or similar structure without experiencing intense anxiety and fear. The image of that blood-covered man and his horrifying invitation to play games continues to invade my thoughts and disturb my sleep, even years after the incident occurred. The house that wouldn't sleep. I was 16 years old when I experienced what I can only describe as one of the most terrifying nights of my entire life. During a summer vacation, I had traveled from my home in the city to visit my aunt and uncle's house in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey. The primary purpose of my visit was to spend time with my cousin Kate, who was 3 years younger than me and had always been like a little sister to me. My aunt and uncle both maintained demanding jobs in Manhattan, which meant they often worked long hours and occasionally attended business-related social events in the evenings. On this particular day, they had decided to attend a company party after work, which would keep them away from home until very late at night. Kate and I spent the entire day at her friend's house, taking advantage of their beautiful swimming pool and enjoying the warm summer weather. We swam, played games, and basked in the sunshine until late in the afternoon. When we finally walked back to Kate's house, it was around 4 o'clock, and the sun was still shining brightly in the clear blue sky. As we settled onto the front steps to rest and cool down, Kate discovered that her cell phone had completely stopped working. The device would not turn on or respond to any buttons, which was unusual but not necessarily cause for alarm. I still had my brand new phone with me, so we were not completely cut off from communication. After spending another hour playing outside in the yard, we decided it would be appropriate to call Kate's mother and let her know that we had returned safely to the house. However, when I attempted to use my phone, I discovered that it was also completely non-functional. We tried removing the battery, reinserting it, and attempting various troubleshooting methods, but nothing seemed to work. With no way to contact Kate's parents and no clear explanation for why both of our phones had simultaneously malfunctioned, we decided to simply go inside the house and wait for her parents to return home. It was approximately 5 o'clock in the evening, and we estimated that Kate's parents would not be home until much later. Kate's older sister Julie was a high school student who had made plans to spend the night at a friend's house, which meant that Kate and I would be completely alone in the large 2-story house for the entire evening. This was not an unusual situation for us, as we had been left alone together many times before, and it had never caused any problems. The house was quite spacious and had a tendency to become very dark once the sun went down. In the living room, we pushed 2 sofas together to create a comfortable sleeping area, just as we always did when I stayed overnight. We were both feeling tired from our day of swimming and sun exposure, so we settled down on the makeshift bed and prepared to get some rest. We had been lying quietly for perhaps 20 minutes when a loud, metallic banging sound echoed through the house from somewhere across the hallway. The noise was sharp and sudden, like someone had dropped a heavy brass object or slammed a metal door. Immediately alert, we got up from the sofas and went to investigate the source of the sound. We checked Kate's bedroom thoroughly, looking for anything that might have fallen or been knocked over, but everything in the room appeared to be exactly as it had been when we left earlier in the day. Convinced that we had simply heard the house settling or perhaps a neighbor making noise, we returned to the living room and tried to go back to sleep. However, approximately 2 hours later, we heard another identical banging sound coming from the same direction. Once again, we investigated Kate's room, searching every corner and examining every piece of furniture and decoration. Nothing had been disturbed or moved, and we could find no explanation for the mysterious noise. This time, we felt a slight sense of unease, but we were still not entirely convinced that anything supernatural or dangerous was occurring. We returned to the living room, but found that sleep was now impossible. We lay awake on the sofas, listening intently to every sound in the house and trying to rationalize what we had heard. Within a short time, we heard the same banging noise for a 3rd time, and we knew that this could not be a coincidence. This time, we decided to approach the investigation more strategically. We positioned ourselves on opposite sides of the hallway and entered Kate's room like a coordinated search team, checking every possible hiding place and examining every object that could potentially make such a noise. Once again, everything in the room was completely intact and undisturbed. We were becoming increasingly nervous and confused, unable to explain the repeated sounds that seemed to be coming from nowhere. After this 3rd incident, sleep became completely impossible. We remained awake on the sofas, our senses heightened and our nerves on edge. As we lay there in the darkness, we began to notice the shadow of a human figure moving near the basement entrance. The basement in Kate's house had no door or barrier, just an open stairway that led down into the darkness below. We called out for Kate's parents, thinking that perhaps they had returned home early and were moving around downstairs, but there was no response to our calls. A quick check of the driveway confirmed that their car was not there, and we knew with certainty that no one else should be in the house with us. The realization that an intruder might be present filled us both with terror and panic. We quietly made our way to the kitchen and each grabbed a sharp knife from the drawer, then crouched down on the floor behind the kitchen island, trying to stay hidden while we decided what to do next. We remained in this position for over an hour, listening for any sounds that might indicate where the intruder was located. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake our fear, and we cautiously returned to the living room sofas. We must have fallen asleep despite our anxiety, because the next thing we knew, we were being awakened by the sound of a girl screaming for help somewhere outside the house. We immediately sprang to our feet and heard someone pounding frantically on the front door. However, our terror was so overwhelming that we were too frightened to answer the door or provide help. Through the windows, we could see not just one shadow, but two distinct figures moving around outside the house. Our fear reached new heights as we realized that multiple people might be trying to gain access to the house. We made sure that all doors and windows were securely locked, then retreated back to the safety of the living room sofas. Approximately 30 minutes later, we were awakened once again, but this time by the flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance visible through the living room windows. The red and blue lights were strobing across the walls, creating an eerie and unsettling atmosphere that added to our already heightened state of fear. Due to complete physical and emotional exhaustion, we managed to fall back asleep despite the chaos occurring outside. Sometime during the early morning hours, Kate's parents finally returned home, and we were awakened once more by the same loud banging sound that had started the entire ordeal. This time, Kate's father emerged from the basement, which was where the master bedroom was located. He was carrying one of his metal baseball bats, clearly prepared to defend his family against whatever threat might be present in the house. All four of us went together into Kate's room to investigate the source of the banging sound that had now occurred multiple times throughout the night. Once again, we found absolutely nothing out of place, nothing fallen, and no explanation for the mysterious noises. The fact that Kate's parents had also heard the loud banging sound confirmed that we had not been imagining things or experiencing some kind of shared hallucination. However, to this day, no one has been able to provide a satisfactory explanation for what occurred in that house during those terrifying hours. The next morning, both Kate's phone and my phone mysteriously began working perfectly again, with no lingering effects from whatever had caused them to malfunction the previous day. After that horrible night, I found myself reluctant to visit Kate's house again. There was something about the experience that left me with a deep sense of unease, and the conviction that the house harbored some kind of supernatural presence or energy that we could not understand or control. Whether the house was genuinely haunted by some kind of paranormal entity, or whether someone had been attempting to break in because they knew the usual occupants were not home, I will never know for certain. But the combination of the mysterious phone malfunctions, the unexplained banging sounds, the shadowy figures, and the screaming voice outside created an experience that I will remember and fear for the rest of my life. The Midnight Encounter. My name is Jessica, and I want to share with you an experience that forever changed how I view personal safety and the potential dangers that can lurk in seemingly innocent situations. This incident occurred during a night when my girlfriend and I had decided to go out for what we expected to be a fun and carefree evening together. We had spent considerable time getting ready for our night out, carefully selecting our outfits and making sure we looked our best. We were both in high spirits and looking forward to enjoying each other's company away from the stresses and responsibilities of our daily lives. After arriving at our destination and spending several hours having fun, we decided to drive to a secluded parking lot where we could have some private, intimate time together. This was not an unusual decision for us, as we often sought out quiet places where we could be alone and express our affection for each other without any interruptions or distractions. We parked the car in what appeared to be a completely empty and isolated parking lot, far from any streetlights or busy roads. The area seemed perfect for our purposes, offering the privacy and seclusion that we desired. My girlfriend reclined the driver's seat, and I positioned myself on top of her as we began to engage in intimate activities. During our passionate encounter, I accidentally pressed against the car's horn with my body, causing it to emit a loud, brief honking sound that echoed through the quiet night air. The unexpected noise startled both of us, and I immediately looked at my girlfriend with concern and embarrassment. "I hope that didn't draw any unwanted attention to us," I whispered, feeling worried that the sound might have been heard by someone in the vicinity. My girlfriend tried to reassure me by pointing out that it was approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, and the chances of anyone being awake or present in such a remote location at that hour were extremely slim. Her logical reasoning helped to calm my nerves, and we decided to continue with our intimate activities. However, less than 3 minutes after the horn incident, something occurred that transformed our romantic evening into a nightmare that would haunt us both for years to come. As I lifted my head to adjust my hair and check our surroundings, I glanced to the right side of the car and saw something that made my blood run cold and my stomach drop with terror. There, just a few feet away from our vehicle, was a man kneeling on the ground and staring directly at us through the car window. His presence was so unexpected and shocking that I could barely process what I was seeing. The realization that we had been watched during our most private and vulnerable moments filled me with a combination of horror, embarrassment, and rage. I immediately jumped off my girlfriend and scrambled into the passenger seat, screaming at the top of my lungs for her to start the car and drive away as fast as possible. My girlfriend, still trying to understand what was happening, fumbled with the seat adjustment mechanism while attempting to return the driver's seat to its upright position. As she struggled with the car controls, the mysterious man slowly stood up from his kneeling position and raised both of his hands in what appeared to be either a gesture of surrender or some kind of twisted greeting. But what I saw next made the entire situation infinitely more terrifying and disturbing. The man's hands were completely covered in fresh blood. The dark red liquid was dripping from his fingers and had stained his clothing, creating a horrific scene that looked like something from a nightmare or horror movie. The sight of all that blood made me feel physically ill, and I knew with absolute certainty that we were in immediate and serious danger. My girlfriend quickly engaged the car's locking mechanism, securing all doors and windows to prevent the bloody stranger from gaining access to our vehicle. Her hands were shaking as she prepared to drive away from this terrifying situation. As we began to pull away from the parking spot, the man called out to us in a voice that was surprisingly calm and measured, given the circumstances. "Don't panic," he said, as if his blood-covered appearance and voyeuristic behavior were somehow normal and acceptable. I screamed at my girlfriend to step on the gas pedal and get us away from this dangerous individual as quickly as possible. As our car accelerated and we began to put distance between ourselves and the stranger, I looked back through the rear window and saw his facial expression change dramatically. The man's previously calm demeanor was replaced by an expression of intense anger and frustration. His face contorted with rage, and he began walking quickly in the direction we had gone, as if he intended to follow us despite the fact that we were in a moving vehicle. As we drove away from the parking lot at high speed, my mind was racing with questions and possibilities about what we had just witnessed. Had this man just committed a violent crime against another person? Was he injured and in need of medical assistance? Could he have been the victim of an attack himself? The uncertainty and lack of answers made the situation even more frightening and confusing. After driving for several minutes in stunned silence, my girlfriend made a decision that surprised me. She suggested that we turn around and go back to the parking lot to see if the man needed help or if we should report the incident to the authorities. Despite my strong reservations about returning to such a dangerous situation, I agreed that we had a moral obligation to ensure that no one else was in danger. When we cautiously drove back toward the parking lot, we were shocked to see 2 police patrol cars approaching the area from different directions, their emergency lights flashing brightly in the darkness. The sight of law enforcement vehicles confirmed that something serious had indeed occurred in that location. We exchanged worried glances as we tried to understand what kind of situation we had unknowingly stumbled into. The presence of multiple police units suggested that a significant crime had taken place, and we realized that we might have been witnesses to something far more serious than we had initially imagined. As we entered the parking lot for the second time that night, we discovered that the mysterious blood-covered man had completely vanished. There was no trace of his presence, and the area appeared to be empty except for the police officers who were beginning their investigation. To this day, I have never learned the identity of that man or discovered what had caused him to be covered in so much blood. I do not know whether he was the perpetrator of a violent crime, the victim of an attack, or someone who was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis that led him to harm himself. What I do know is that this terrifying encounter forever changed my approach to personal safety and situational awareness. I now make absolutely certain that my car doors are locked whenever I am in an isolated location, and I always carry a personal safety device with me wherever I go. The memory of that man's blood-covered hands and his unsettling calm demeanor continues to disturb my sleep and invade my thoughts during quiet moments. The realization that we had been completely vulnerable and unaware of the potential danger surrounding us serves as a constant reminder of how quickly an ordinary evening can transform into a life-threatening situation. The final truth. The conclusion to our collection of terrifying experiences brings us to a story that demonstrates how sometimes the most ordinary people in our lives can harbor the darkest and most dangerous secrets. This final account involves a man named Steve, whose seemingly normal exterior concealed a capacity for violence that would ultimately destroy multiple lives and shatter the sense of security that we all take for granted in our daily routines. Steve had worked as a receptionist in a large apartment complex for several years, and by all outward appearances, he seemed to be a reliable and trustworthy employee. His colleagues and the residents of the building had no reason to suspect that he posed any kind of threat to their safety or well-being. He performed his duties competently, maintained a professional demeanor, and gave no obvious signs of the violent tendencies that lurked beneath his calm exterior. However, what the residents and management of the apartment complex did not know was that Steve had been using his position of trust and his access to building security systems to engage in increasingly dangerous and criminal behavior. His job provided him with intimate knowledge of the building's layout, the schedules and habits of various residents, and most importantly, access to master keys that could open any apartment in the entire complex. The situation reached a horrifying climax on a Sunday evening when police officers arrived at the apartment complex to investigate reports of a violent crime that had occurred in apartment 34. What they discovered when they entered that unit was a scene of such brutality and horror that it would haunt the investigating officers for the rest of their careers. The victim was a male resident who had been living alone in the apartment for several months. He had been brutally attacked and murdered in what appeared to be an extremely violent and personal assault. The crime scene was covered with blood, and the evidence suggested that the victim had fought desperately for his life before succumbing to his injuries. Initially, the police had no clear suspects or obvious motives for such a brutal crime. The victim had no known enemies, no history of involvement in dangerous activities, and no apparent reason why anyone would want to harm him. The investigation seemed destined to become another unsolved case that would provide no justice for the victim or closure for his family and friends. However, the breakthrough in the case came when investigators decided to examine the building's extensive security camera system. The apartment complex was equipped with multiple cameras that monitored various areas throughout the building, including hallways, elevators, entrance and exit points, and the reception area where Steve worked. When the police reviewed the security footage from the day of the murder, they made a discovery that shocked everyone involved in the investigation. The cameras clearly showed Steve leaving his reception desk and walking to a secure storage area where the building's master keys were kept. The footage showed him removing the key to apartment 34 and placing it in his pocket before returning to his desk. Additional camera footage revealed Steve walking through the hallways of the building toward the floor where apartment 34 was located. The timestamp on the video corresponded exactly with the estimated time when the murder had occurred, providing investigators with crucial evidence linking Steve to the crime scene. Perhaps most damning of all was the footage that showed Steve returning to the reception area after the murder had taken place. The cameras captured clear images of bloodstains on his shirt, which he had attempted to conceal by putting on a jacket or vest. His behavior appeared nervous and agitated, completely different from his usual calm and professional demeanor. When investigators collected DNA evidence and fingerprints from the crime scene, they found conclusive proof that Steve had been present in apartment 34 during the time of the murder. His genetic material and fingerprints were found throughout the apartment, on the victim's body, and on various objects that had been used as weapons during the attack. The evidence against Steve was overwhelming and undeniable. The security cameras had recorded his every movement, creating a complete timeline of his criminal activities that left no room for doubt or alternative explanations. The physical evidence corroborated everything that the video footage had revealed, making it impossible for him to deny his involvement in the brutal murder. When Steve was finally confronted with this mountain of evidence during police questioning, his calm facade completely crumbled. The man who had successfully maintained an appearance of normalcy and respectability for so many years was revealed to be a dangerous and remorseless killer who had used his position of trust to prey upon innocent victims. During his interrogation, Steve offered various contradictory and nonsensical explanations for his presence in the apartment and for the victim's death. At different times, he claimed that he had been trying to help the victim, that he had discovered the body and panicked, and that he had been attempting to start a conversation with a resident that had somehow gone terribly wrong. None of these explanations could account for the extensive evidence of premeditation and violence that investigators had uncovered. The security footage clearly showed that Steve had deliberately obtained the key to the apartment, had specifically targeted this particular victim, and had spent a considerable amount of time in the apartment during the commission of the crime. As the investigation continued, police began to suspect that Steve's crime spree might not have been limited to this single murder. They began examining other unsolved crimes and mysterious disappearances that had occurred in the apartment complex and surrounding area during Steve's employment there. The revelation that someone they had trusted and interacted with on a daily basis was capable of such horrific violence sent shockwaves throughout the apartment complex and the surrounding community. Residents who had always felt safe and secure in their homes suddenly realized that the greatest threat to their safety had been someone who worked in their own building, someone who had access to their apartments and intimate knowledge of their daily routines. The case serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary and unremarkable facades. Steve's ability to maintain a normal appearance while harboring such violent tendencies demonstrates how difficult it can be to identify truly dangerous individuals in our communities. The security camera footage that ultimately led to Steve's arrest also highlights the importance of modern surveillance technology in solving crimes and bringing dangerous criminals to justice. Without those cameras, Steve might have continued his violent activities indefinitely, claiming more innocent victims while maintaining his cover as a trustworthy and reliable employee. The victim's family, while grateful that their loved one's killer had been caught and would face justice, struggled to understand how such a senseless and brutal crime could have occurred. The randomness of the attack, and the fact that their family member had been targeted simply because he lived in an apartment that Steve had access to, made the tragedy even more difficult to accept and process. The apartment complex was forced to completely overhaul its security procedures and access control systems in the aftermath of Steve's arrest. Management implemented new policies requiring multiple staff members to be present whenever master keys were accessed, installed additional security cameras, and conducted thorough background checks on all employees. Despite these improved security measures, many residents chose to move out of the building, unable to continue living in a place where such a horrific crime had occurred. The sense of safety and community that had once characterized the apartment complex was permanently shattered by Steve's actions. Steve was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for his actions and offered no meaningful explanation for why he had chosen to take an innocent life in such a brutal and senseless manner. The case remains a sobering reminder that we can never truly know what darkness might lurk in the hearts of the people around us, even those we see and interact with every day. The individuals who seem most trustworthy and reliable can sometimes pose the greatest threats to our safety and well-being. For the victim's family, friends, and the entire community affected by this tragedy, the scars left by Steve's actions will never fully heal. The knowledge that such evil can exist in plain sight, hiding behind a mask of normalcy and respectability, serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of safety and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The story of Steve and his victim stands as a testament to the importance of remaining vigilant and aware of our surroundings, even in places where we feel most secure. It reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with obvious warning signs, but can sometimes remain hidden until it strikes without warning, forever changing the lives of everyone it touches. This collection of true horror stories serves as a reminder that the most terrifying experiences often occur not in fictional tales or movie theaters, but in real life, when ordinary people encounter extraordinary evil in their everyday environments. These experiences forever change those who survive them, leaving lasting scars that serve as permanent reminders of how quickly life can transform from normal and predictable to terrifying and life-threatening. The individuals who shared these stories have demonstrated incredible courage in reliving their most frightening moments and sharing them with others. Their willingness to describe these traumatic experiences serves not only as a form of personal catharsis, but also as a warning to others about the potential dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places and situations. Each of these stories reinforces the importance of trusting our instincts, remaining aware of our surroundings, and taking appropriate precautions to protect ourselves and our loved ones. They remind us that while we cannot control all of the dangers that exist in our world, we can take steps to minimize our vulnerability and increase our chances of surviving when we encounter genuine threats. The lasting impact of these experiences on their survivors serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and our capacity to overcome even the most terrifying and traumatic situations. While the scars from these encounters may never fully fade, they also serve as reminders of the strength and courage that we all possess when faced with life-threatening danger. These stories will continue to serve as cautionary tales for anyone who reads them, providing valuable insights into the nature of evil and the importance of remaining vigilant in an unpredictable and sometimes dangerous world. They remind us that horror is not confined to the realm of fiction, but can intrude into our real lives when we least expect it, forever changing our understanding of safety, trust, and the capacity for both good and evil that exists within humanity. The elevator that never stopped. My name is Marcus, and I work as a security guard in a 40-story office building in downtown Chicago. This incident happened during my night shift about 6 months ago, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Working the graveyard shift in a mostly empty building had always been peaceful, almost meditative, but that night changed everything I thought I knew about my workplace. It was approximately 2:30 in the morning when I noticed something unusual on my security monitors. One of the elevators was moving between floors continuously, stopping at random levels without anyone calling for it. This was highly irregular, as the building was supposed to be completely empty except for myself and the cleaning crew, who had already finished their work and left for the night. I decided to investigate this anomaly personally, taking my flashlight and radio as I made my way to the elevator bank on the first floor. As I approached the elevators, I could hear the familiar mechanical sounds of the car moving up and down the shaft, accompanied by the soft dinging noise that indicated stops at various floors. When I pressed the call button, the doors opened immediately, revealing an empty elevator car that appeared completely normal. I stepped inside and examined the control panel, looking for any signs of malfunction or tampering. Everything seemed to be in perfect working order, with no obvious explanation for the erratic behavior I had observed on my monitors. I decided to ride the elevator to the top floor to check if perhaps someone had accidentally left the building without properly signing out. As the elevator began its ascent, I noticed that it was stopping at floors that I had not selected. The car would pause for approximately 10 seconds at each unauthorized stop. The doors would open to reveal empty hallways, and then continue upward without any input from me. By the time I reached the 20th floor, I was beginning to feel genuinely unsettled by the situation. The elevator's autonomous behavior was unlike anything I had encountered in my 3 years of working in this building. As the doors opened on floor 21, I was startled to hear what sounded like children laughing and playing somewhere in the distance. This was impossible, as the building was strictly commercial space with no residential units, and it was the middle of the night. Children should not have been anywhere in the vicinity, let alone inside a locked office building. The laughter echoed through the empty corridors, creating an eerie and unsettling atmosphere that made my skin crawl. I immediately used my radio to contact building management and report the unusual activity, but I received only static in response. My radio, which had been working perfectly just minutes earlier, now seemed to be completely dead. I tried my cell phone, but discovered that I had no signal despite being in an area where coverage was usually excellent. As the elevator continued its unauthorized journey upward, stopping at seemingly random floors, I began to notice other disturbing phenomena. On several floors, I could see shadows moving across the walls of empty offices, visible through the glass partitions that separated the workspace from the hallway. These shadows moved with purpose and intelligence, as if cast by people walking around inside the offices. But when I stepped off the elevator to investigate these shadow movements, I found only empty rooms filled with desks, computers, and office equipment. There were no people present, no explanations for the shadows I had clearly observed, and no signs that anyone had been in these spaces recently. The most terrifying moment came when the elevator stopped at the 34th floor. As the doors opened, I was greeted by the sight of a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in the middle of the hallway. She was wearing a white dress that appeared to be from a much earlier time period, and her long blonde hair was arranged in old-fashioned braids. The child looked directly at me with large, sad eyes, and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Are you here to play with us, mister? We've been waiting for someone to find us for such a long time." Before I could respond or even fully process what I was seeing, the elevator doors closed automatically, and the car began moving upward again. I frantically pressed the button to return to the 34th floor, but the elevator refused to respond to my commands and continued climbing toward the upper levels of the building. When I finally managed to reach the ground floor and exit the elevator, I immediately contacted the police and building management to report what I had experienced. A thorough search of the entire building was conducted, but no children were found anywhere in the complex. During the investigation, I learned some disturbing history about the building that had never been shared with the security staff. In 1987, a tragic accident had occurred during the building's construction. A section of scaffolding had collapsed, resulting in the deaths of several workers and, horrifically, 3 children who had been visiting the construction site with their father. The children had been trapped in the elevator shaft when the scaffolding fell, and their bodies had not been recovered for several hours. According to the construction records, they had died on what would later become the 34th floor of the completed building. Since learning this information, I have experienced several more encounters with the mysterious elevator activity and the ghostly children who seem to inhabit the building. Other security guards have reported similar experiences, though management continues to dismiss these incidents as imagination or equipment malfunctions. I still work in the same building, but I now avoid using the elevators whenever possible, preferring to take the stairs even when traveling to higher floors. The memory of that little girl's sad eyes and her request to play continues to haunt me, serving as a constant reminder that some places hold on to their tragic past in ways that we cannot fully understand or explain. The camping trip from hell. This story takes place during what was supposed to be a fun and relaxing camping trip with my college friends during our spring break. We had planned this adventure for months, carefully selecting a remote camping location in the mountains of Colorado where we could disconnect from technology and enjoy the beauty of nature together. Our group consisted of 6 people: myself, my roommate David, my girlfriend Sarah, and 3 other close friends from our university. We had all been looking forward to this trip as a way to bond, create lasting memories, and take a break from the intense pressure of our academic studies. The campsite we had reserved was located deep in the wilderness, approximately 2 hours' drive from the nearest town. The isolation was exactly what we were seeking, as it would allow us to enjoy campfires, stargazing, and outdoor activities without any distractions from modern life. The area was known for its stunning scenic beauty, with towering pine trees, crystal-clear streams, and breathtaking mountain vistas. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon and spent several hours setting up our tents, organizing our supplies, and familiarizing ourselves with the layout of the area. The weather was perfect for camping, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that promised ideal conditions for our outdoor adventure. As evening approached, we built a large campfire and gathered around it to cook dinner, share stories, and enjoy each other's company. The atmosphere was exactly what we had hoped for: relaxed, fun, and filled with laughter and conversation. We felt completely at peace in our isolated mountain paradise. However, as darkness began to fall and the forest around us grew quiet, we started to notice sounds that seemed out of place in the natural environment. At first, these noises were subtle and easy to dismiss: the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, and what sounded like footsteps moving through the underbrush surrounding our campsite. David, who had extensive experience with wilderness camping, assured us that these sounds were completely normal and were probably caused by deer, elk, or other wildlife moving through the forest during their nighttime activities. His confident explanation helped to calm our nerves, and we continued enjoying our evening around the campfire. But as the night progressed, the sounds became more frequent, more deliberate, and increasingly difficult to explain as natural wildlife activity. We began to hear what sounded like human voices whispering in the distance, though the words were too faint and distorted for us to understand what was being said. Sarah was the first to express serious concern about these mysterious sounds. She pointed out that the voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if we were being surrounded by unseen people moving through the forest around our campsite. The realization that we might not be alone in this remote wilderness location filled all of us with growing anxiety and fear. We decided to extinguish our campfire and retreat to our tents for the night, hoping that whatever was causing these disturbances would lose interest in our presence and move on to other areas of the forest. We had brought walkie-talkies specifically for this trip, and we agreed to maintain communication between our tents throughout the night. Inside our tent, Sarah and I lay awake, listening to the continued sounds of movement and whispered conversations outside. The noises seemed to be getting closer to our campsite, and we could occasionally hear the distinct sound of footsteps moving around the perimeter of our tent circle. Around midnight, David's voice crackled through our walkie-talkie, filled with urgency and fear. "Guys, there are people with flashlights moving around outside our tents. I can see the beams of light through the tent fabric, and they're definitely not trying to hide their presence." We immediately looked out through the small window of our tent and confirmed David's observation. There were indeed multiple flashlight beams moving in coordinated patterns around our campsite, as if a group of people were conducting some kind of systematic search or surveillance operation. The most terrifying aspect of this situation was the complete silence of these mysterious intruders. Despite the fact that we could clearly see their lights and occasionally catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving between the trees, we heard no voices, no conversation, and no sounds that would indicate normal human activity. Sarah grabbed my arm tightly and whispered, "We need to get out of here right now. This isn't right. Something is very wrong about this situation." I agreed completely with her assessment, but we faced the terrifying reality that we were trapped in our tents, surrounded by unknown individuals whose intentions were completely unclear. Our cars were parked approximately 50 yards away from our campsite, and reaching them would require us to cross an open area where we would be completely exposed and vulnerable. As we tried to formulate an escape plan, the flashlight beams suddenly converged on our tent, illuminating the fabric walls and making it clear that whoever was outside knew exactly where we were located. The lights remained focused on our tent for several minutes, creating an atmosphere of intense psychological pressure and fear. Then, without any warning or explanation, all of the lights disappeared simultaneously, plunging the entire area back into complete darkness. The sudden absence of the flashlight beams was somehow even more frightening than their presence had been, as we now had no way of knowing where our mysterious watchers were located or what they might be planning. We waited in terrified silence for approximately 30 minutes, straining to hear any sounds that might indicate the presence of the intruders. When we finally worked up the courage to unzip our tent and look outside, we discovered that our campsite appeared to be completely deserted. Moving as quietly as possible, we gathered our most essential belongings and made our way toward our vehicles. The other members of our group had the same idea, and we all met at the cars without anyone speaking above a whisper. As we loaded our gear and prepared to leave the campsite, David made a discovery that sent a new wave of terror through our group. The tires on 2 of our 3 vehicles had been slashed, making them completely undrivable. Only 1 car remained functional, but it could not accommodate all 6 members of our group plus our equipment. We made the difficult decision to abandon most of our camping gear and crowd into the single working vehicle. As we drove away from the campsite as quickly as the mountain roads would allow, I looked back through the rear window and saw multiple flashlight beams reappearing in the area we had just vacated. We drove straight to the nearest town and immediately reported the incident to the local police. The officers who took our statement informed us that there had been several similar reports from campers in that area over the past few months, involving groups of people with flashlights who seemed to be targeting isolated camping parties. The police suspected that these incidents were related to either drug trafficking operations or potentially more sinister criminal activity involving the harassment and intimidation of vulnerable campers. They advised us to never return to that particular area and to always inform others of our camping plans when venturing into remote wilderness locations. To this day, none of us have ever returned to that campsite or even considered camping in that region of Colorado. The experience left us all with a deep appreciation for the potential dangers that can exist in seemingly peaceful and beautiful natural environments, and a renewed respect for the importance of safety precautions when venturing into isolated areas. The House Sitter's Nightmare. My name is Rachel, and I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of thoroughly vetting job opportunities before accepting them, especially when they involve staying in unfamiliar locations. This incident occurred 3 years ago when I was a college student desperately trying to earn extra money to help pay for my education and living expenses. I had found what seemed like the perfect opportunity through an online house-sitting service. A wealthy family was going on an extended vacation to Europe and needed someone to stay in their beautiful suburban home for 3 weeks, taking care of their plants, collecting mail, and providing general security and maintenance. The house was absolutely stunning, a large Victorian-style home with intricate architectural details, beautiful gardens, and an overall atmosphere of elegance and prosperity. The family seemed friendly and trustworthy during our initial meeting, and they offered generous compensation for what appeared to be very simple and straightforward responsibilities. For the first week of my house-sitting assignment, everything went exactly as planned. I maintained the property, enjoyed the luxurious amenities, and felt grateful for the opportunity to live in such a beautiful home while earning money at the same time. The neighborhood was quiet and safe, and I had no reason to believe that anything unusual or dangerous might occur. However, during the beginning of my second week alone in the house, I started to notice subtle changes and disturbances that gradually escalated into something far more sinister and threatening. It began with small items being moved or displaced from their original positions. At first, I attributed these changes to my own forgetfulness or absent-mindedness. Perhaps I had moved a book from the coffee table to the kitchen counter and simply forgotten about it. Maybe I had left a window open when I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. These minor inconsistencies seemed easily explained by the stress of living in an unfamiliar environment. But as the days passed, the disturbances became more frequent and more obvious. I would carefully arrange items in specific locations before leaving the house to run errands, only to return and find them in completely different rooms. Doors that I distinctly remembered closing would be standing wide open, and windows that I had secured would be unlocked and slightly ajar. The most unsettling aspect of these changes was their systematic and deliberate nature. It was not as if objects were being randomly displaced by wind, pets, or natural causes. Instead, someone or something appeared to be intentionally rearranging items in ways that would be immediately noticeable to me upon my return. One evening, as I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps walking across the floor directly above me. The sounds were slow, deliberate, and heavy, clearly indicating the presence of an adult person moving around in the upstairs portion of the house. My initial reaction was to convince myself that the sounds were caused by the old house settling, or perhaps some kind of animal that had found its way into the attic space. But as I listened more carefully, the footsteps followed a clear pattern that suggested someone was walking from room to room in a purposeful and methodical manner. Gathering my courage, I climbed the stairs to investigate the source of these sounds. I checked every room on the second floor thoroughly, looking in closets, under beds, and behind furniture, but I found no evidence of any intruder or explanation for the footsteps I had clearly heard. As I was completing my search of the master bedroom, I heard the front door of the house slam shut with tremendous force. The sound echoed throughout the entire house, and I knew immediately that someone had either entered or exited the building while I was upstairs investigating the mysterious footsteps. Racing downstairs as quickly as I could, I found that the front door was indeed closed, but I distinctly remembered leaving it slightly open for ventilation while I was cooking dinner. More disturbing was the discovery that the security alarm system had been disabled, despite the fact that I had activated it before going upstairs. I immediately called the police and reported a possible break-in, though I had to admit that I had no direct evidence of an intruder and could not be certain that someone had actually entered the house. The responding officers conducted a thorough search of the entire property, including the basement, attic, and all outdoor buildings, but they found no signs of forced entry or unauthorized presence. However, during their investigation, the police made a discovery that sent chills down my spine. They found fresh footprints in the soft soil of the garden outside the kitchen window, footprints that had definitely not been there when I had watered the plants earlier that day. The prints appeared to belong to someone with large feet, possibly a male adult, and they led from the street to the house and then disappeared on the concrete patio. The officers advised me to consider staying elsewhere for the remainder of my house-sitting assignment, but I felt obligated to fulfill my commitment to the homeowners who were still traveling in Europe. I also needed the money desperately and could not afford to forfeit my payment by abandoning the job. For the next several nights, I implemented additional security measures, including moving furniture in front of doors, setting up makeshift alarms using pots and pans, and sleeping with a large kitchen knife within easy reach. Despite these precautions, the mysterious disturbances continued to escalate. I began to find handwritten notes hidden in various locations throughout the house. These notes contained disturbing messages like, "I know you're here," "You don't belong in this house," and "Leave now while you still can." The handwriting was erratic and childish, as if written by someone with limited education or possibly mental instability. The most terrifying note I discovered was left on my pillow while I was taking a shower. When I returned to the bedroom, I found a piece of paper with the words, "I've been watching you sleep," written in red ink that looked disturbingly similar to dried blood. On my final night in the house, I was awakened around 3 o'clock in the morning by the sound of someone playing a piano in the living room downstairs. The music was beautiful but melancholy, a classical piece that I did not recognize. What made this particularly frightening was that the family had specifically told me that the piano had been broken for years and was purely decorative. I crept quietly to the top of the stairs and peered down into the living room, where I could see a shadowy figure seated at the piano bench. The person appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing and had long hair that cascaded down their back. Their fingers moved gracefully across the keys, producing hauntingly beautiful melodies that filled the house with an otherworldly atmosphere. As I watched this impossible scene unfold, the piano player suddenly stopped mid-song and slowly turned their head in my direction. Although I could not see their face clearly in the darkness, I felt certain that they were looking directly at me with an awareness that made my blood run cold. I immediately retreated to the bedroom, packed my belongings as quietly as possible, and left the house before dawn. I drove straight to a nearby hotel and called the homeowners to explain that a family emergency required me to end my house-sitting assignment early. When the family returned from their vacation and I met with them to return their keys, they asked if I had experienced anything unusual during my stay. I decided to tell them about some of the incidents, carefully omitting the most frightening details to avoid alarming them unnecessarily. To my surprise, the husband nodded knowingly and explained that they had actually hired me because previous house-sitters had also reported similar experiences and had often abandoned their assignments early. They had hoped that a young college student might be less susceptible to whatever was causing these disturbances. The family then revealed that their house had been built on the site of an old orphanage that had burned down in the early 1900s, resulting in the deaths of several children and staff members. They had purchased the property at a significantly reduced price due to its history and the reputation it had developed over the years. While they had never personally experienced any supernatural activity, they acknowledged that many house-sitters, maintenance workers, and visitors had reported encounters with ghostly children, mysterious piano music, and other unexplained phenomena throughout the house. Despite this knowledge, the family had chosen to continue living in the house because they loved its architecture and location, and they had simply accepted the supernatural activity as part of their daily lives. They had learned to ignore the disturbances and had developed coping strategies for dealing with the ongoing paranormal events. I never returned to that house, and I have been much more careful about researching the history of any properties where I consider taking house-sitting jobs. The experience taught me that some places carry the weight of their tragic past in ways that can profoundly impact the living, and that not all job opportunities are worth the psychological and emotional toll they might exact. The wrong turn. This terrifying experience happened to me and my best friend Jake during what was supposed to be a simple drive to visit his girlfriend who lived in a neighboring state. We had made this trip several times before without any problems, but on this particular night, a combination of poor weather, fatigue, and a wrong turn led us into a situation that neither of us will ever forget. We had left town around 6 o'clock in the evening, planning to arrive at Jake's girlfriend's house by 9:30 for a late dinner and movie night. The drive normally took about 3.5 hours, but we had gotten a late start due to Jake's work schedule, and we were trying to make up time by taking some back roads that promised to be faster than the main highway. About 2 hours into our journey, a heavy fog began to roll in, reducing visibility to just a few feet beyond our headlight beams. The winding country roads became increasingly difficult to navigate, and we found ourselves driving much slower than we had anticipated. Road signs became impossible to read until we were almost directly underneath them, and we quickly realized that we had no clear idea of our exact location. When we came to a fork in the road that we did not recognize from our previous trips, Jake made what he thought was an educated guess about which direction would lead us back to our intended route. Unfortunately, his decision led us deeper into unfamiliar territory, down a narrow gravel road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the foggy darkness. After driving for approximately 20 minutes without seeing any houses, signs, or other indications of civilization, we decided that we had definitely made a wrong turn and needed to find a place where we could safely turn around and retrace our path. The road was too narrow for a U-turn, and the fog made it dangerous to attempt any kind of complex maneuvering. Just as we were beginning to discuss our options for getting back on track, our headlights illuminated a small building ahead of us on the right side of the road. As we drew closer, we could see that it was an old, run-down gas station with a single flickering light hanging over the entrance door. The building appeared to be decades old, with peeling paint, boarded windows, and an overall appearance of abandonment and decay. However, the presence of that one working light suggested that the station might still be operational, or at least that someone was maintaining the property. Jake decided to pull into the gravel parking area in front of the building to see if we could get directions, or at least confirm our location, so we could figure out how to get back to the main highway. As we parked the car and turned off the engine, the silence that surrounded us was absolutely deafening. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant voices, no mechanical noises, and no signs of life anywhere in the immediate vicinity. The fog had become so thick that we could barely see beyond the range of the single light bulb, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a scene from a horror movie than a real-life situation. Jake suggested that he go inside the gas station to ask for directions, while I remained in the car with the engine running, ready to drive away quickly if necessary. This plan seemed reasonable, as it would allow us to maintain our mobility while still obtaining the help we needed. As Jake approached the entrance to the building, I noticed that the front door was standing slightly ajar, despite the late hour and the apparent lack of customers. Through the gap in the door, I could see a faint, yellowish light flickering inside the building, suggesting that someone might indeed be present. Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside, calling out a friendly greeting to announce his presence. I watched through the car window as he disappeared into the building, expecting him to emerge within a few minutes with directions and possibly some snacks for our continued journey. But minutes passed, and Jake did not reappear. 5 minutes became 10, then 15, and I began to feel increasingly anxious about his prolonged absence. The building was small enough that any conversation or transaction should have been completed quickly, and Jake's failure to return was beginning to worry me significantly. I considered going inside to check on him, but something about the atmosphere and my growing sense of unease made me reluctant to leave the safety of the locked car. Instead, I decided to wait a few more minutes and see if Jake would emerge on his own. 20 minutes after Jake had entered the building, I made the decision to investigate his disappearance personally. I left the car engine running and the doors unlocked so that we could make a quick escape if necessary, and I approached the gas station entrance with extreme caution. As I pushed open the front door and stepped inside, I was immediately struck by the overwhelming smell of decay and neglect that permeated the entire building. The interior was dimly lit by a few flickering fluorescent bulbs, and dust particles danced in the weak light like tiny ghosts. The gas station appeared to have been abandoned for many years, with empty shelves, broken equipment, and a thick layer of dust covering every surface. There was no sign of Jake anywhere in the building, and no indication that anyone had been inside recently. I called out Jake's name repeatedly, my voice echoing through the empty space, but received no response. I searched every corner of the building, including a small office area and a storage room in the back, but found no trace of my friend or any clue about where he might have gone. Panic began to set in as I realized that Jake had somehow vanished completely from a building that had only one entrance and no obvious way for someone to leave without being seen. I ran back to the car and used my cell phone to call Jake's number, but my calls went straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was either turned off or out of service range. I faced an impossible decision. Should I remain at the gas station and continue searching for Jake, or should I drive to the nearest town and contact the police for help? The thought of leaving without my best friend felt like abandonment, but I also knew that staying alone in such an isolated and unsettling location might put me in danger as well. After struggling with this decision for several more minutes, I chose to drive toward what I hoped would be civilization, with the intention of finding help and returning with assistance as quickly as possible. The fog made navigation extremely difficult, but I eventually found my way back to a main road and then to a small town with a police station. The officers who responded to my report took the situation very seriously and immediately organized a search party to return to the abandoned gas station. However, when we arrived at the location where I was certain the building had been standing, we found only an empty lot filled with overgrown weeds and scattered debris. There was no gas station, no building, and no sign that any structure had ever existed in that location. The police officers were clearly puzzled by my insistence that I had seen a building there just a few hours earlier, and I began to question my own memory and sanity. A more extensive search of the area revealed no trace of Jake, his clothing, his phone, or any evidence that he had ever been in that location. Despite continued investigations and searches over the following weeks, Jake was never found, and his disappearance remains an unsolved mystery to this day. The official police report classified Jake's disappearance as a missing person case with no evidence of foul play, But I know what I experienced that night. I know that we stopped at a gas station that should not have existed, and I know that my best friend walked into that building and never came out. The incident has left me with lasting psychological trauma and a deep fear of driving alone, especially on unfamiliar roads or during conditions of poor visibility. I have undergone therapy to help process the guilt and confusion that resulted from Jake's disappearance, but I continue to struggle with questions about what really happened that night and whether I could have done something differently to save my friend. The midnight shift. Working as a nurse in a large hospital requires dealing with life and death situations on a regular basis, but nothing in my medical training prepared me for the supernatural encounter I experienced during one particularly memorable night shift. This incident occurred at Metropolitan General Hospital, where I had been employed for approximately 2 years in the intensive care unit. The ICU is naturally a place where emotions run high, where families face their worst fears, and where the boundary between life and death seems thinner than anywhere else. As healthcare professionals, we become accustomed to dealing with loss, grief, and the intense atmosphere that pervades areas where critically ill patients receive treatment. On this particular night, I was assigned to work alone in the ICU from 11 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock the following morning. This was not unusual, as budget constraints often required nurses to work solo shifts during overnight hours when patient activity and family visitation were typically minimal. The unit contained 8 patient rooms, but on this night, only 3 of them were occupied. Room 307 contained an elderly gentleman recovering from major heart surgery. Room 312 housed a middle-aged woman who had been in a car accident, and room 315 was occupied by a young man who had suffered a severe head injury in a workplace accident. Around 1:30 in the morning, while I was updating patient charts at the nurses' station, I noticed that the call light for room 318 was illuminated on my monitoring panel. This was immediately concerning, as room 318 was supposed to be empty and had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the next patient admission. I walked down the hallway toward room 318, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished linoleum floor. The hospital corridors always felt different during overnight hours, with dim lighting and an atmosphere of quiet intensity that could be both peaceful and unsettling. When I reached room 318 and pushed open the door, I expected to find an empty room with a malfunctioning call button system. Instead, I discovered an elderly woman lying in the hospital bed, covered with a white sheet and appearing to be resting comfortably. This discovery was extremely confusing, as I had no record of any patient admission to room 318, and there had been no activity in that room when I had completed my initial rounds earlier in the evening. I approached the bed cautiously, thinking that perhaps there had been some kind of administrative error or miscommunication about patient assignments. As I drew closer to the elderly woman, I noticed that her skin had an unusual pale, almost translucent quality that immediately raised medical concerns. Her breathing appeared to be very shallow and irregular, and her overall appearance suggested that she might be in critical condition. I gently touched her shoulder to check her responsiveness, but her skin felt unnaturally cold, much colder than would be normal for a living person. When I checked for a pulse at her wrist, I could detect no heartbeat whatsoever, yet she continued to breathe in slow, barely perceptible patterns. Alarmed by these contradictory vital signs, I immediately pressed the emergency call button to summon additional medical staff and began preparing to initiate emergency resuscitation procedures. However, before I could take any further action, the elderly woman opened her eyes and looked directly at me. Her eyes were completely black, with no visible iris or pupil, just deep, dark voids that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The sight of those impossible eyes filled me with a terror that I had never experienced in all my years of medical practice. The woman spoke to me in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but her words were clear and distinct. "You cannot save me, child. I have been waiting here for someone to help me cross over, but I am trapped between worlds." Before I could respond or even fully process what she had said, the woman's eyes closed again, and she became completely motionless. When I checked for vital signs this time, I found no pulse, no breathing, and no other indicators of life. I immediately called for the attending physician and the hospital security team, but when they arrived at room 318 just minutes later, they found only an empty bed with no sign that anyone had been there recently. The sheets were perfectly clean and arranged, and there was no evidence of any patient having occupied the room. The security footage from the hallway cameras showed me entering and exiting room 318, but the video revealed no other person in the room at any time. According to the digital records, no patient had been admitted to that room in over a week, and no medical equipment or supplies had been checked out for use in that location. My colleagues and supervisors were understandably skeptical of my account, and I began to question whether the stress of working long night shifts had caused me to experience some kind of hallucination or mental breakdown. However, I knew with absolute certainty that what I had experienced was real and not a product of my imagination. Over the following weeks, I conducted some research into the history of room 318 and discovered that it had been the site of several unexplained deaths over the years. Patients who had been expected to recover from minor procedures had suddenly passed away in that room for no apparent medical reason. Additionally, several other nurses and staff members had reported similar encounters with mysterious patients who appeared and disappeared without explanation, always in room 318. These reports had been dismissed by management as stress-related incidents or misunderstandings, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. I eventually requested to be transferred to a different unit within the hospital, as I found it impossible to work effectively while constantly worrying about encountering the mysterious elderly woman again. The experience left me with a deep appreciation for the mysteries that exist beyond our understanding of life and death, and a recognition that some places seem to serve as gateways between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. The photo that should not exist. As a professional photographer specializing in real estate and architectural photography, I have had the opportunity to visit and document hundreds of different properties throughout my career. Most of these assignments are routine and uneventful, involving the systematic photographing of rooms, exteriors, and architectural details for marketing and promotional purposes. However, one particular assignment from last year resulted in an experience that challenged everything I thought I knew about photography, reality, and the nature of what can be captured through a camera lens. The property in question was a historic Victorian mansion that had been on the market for several months without attracting any serious buyers. The real estate agent who hired me explained that the house had a reputation for being difficult to sell due to various rumors and stories that had circulated about the property over the years. She was hoping that professional photography would help to present the house in its best light and overcome whatever negative perceptions potential buyers might have. The mansion was certainly impressive from an architectural standpoint, with elaborate woodwork, stained glass windows, original hardwood floors, and all of the charming details that make historic properties so appealing to certain buyers. The building had been well maintained over the years, and despite its age, it was in excellent structural condition. I began my photography session in the late afternoon, taking advantage of the natural light that was streaming through the large windows throughout the house. The interior spaces were beautifully appointed with period-appropriate furnishings and decorations that had been carefully preserved by previous owners. Working systematically through each room, I captured multiple angles of the living spaces, bedrooms, kitchen, and bathrooms, ensuring that potential buyers would be able to appreciate the full scope and beauty of the property. The house photographed beautifully, with rich textures and warm lighting that highlighted its historic charm and character. As I was completing my work in the master bedroom on the second floor, I decided to take a few additional shots of the ornate fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. The fireplace was a stunning example of Victorian craftsmanship, with intricate carved details and beautiful tile work that deserved special attention in my documentation. I set up my tripod and camera to capture the fireplace from the optimal angle, adjusting my lighting equipment to ensure that all of the decorative details would be clearly visible in the final photographs. As I looked through my camera viewfinder to compose the shot, I noticed something that made me pause and look more carefully. In the ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace mantel, I could see the reflection of someone standing behind me in the doorway of the bedroom. The figure appeared to be a woman wearing a long, dark dress that seemed to be from a much earlier time period, possibly the late 1800s when the house had originally been built. Assuming that the real estate agent had returned to check on my progress, I lowered my camera and turned around to greet her. However, when I looked toward the doorway, I found that it was completely empty. There was no one standing behind me, and I could hear no sounds of movement anywhere else in the house. Confused by this discrepancy, I looked back at the mirror above the fireplace, and the reflection of the mysterious woman was no longer visible. I convinced myself that I had simply seen a shadow or some kind of optical illusion created by the interaction between my lighting equipment and the reflective surface of the antique mirror. I resumed my photography work, but as I continued taking pictures of the fireplace, I began to notice the woman's reflection appearing and disappearing in the mirror at random intervals. Sometimes she would be clearly visible for several seconds, and other times the mirror would reflect only the normal contents of the room. What made this phenomenon particularly unsettling was that the woman's reflection never corresponded with any actual person being present in the room. I was completely alone in the house, yet the mirror continued to show someone standing behind me who existed only in the reflected image. Determined to document this unusual occurrence, I began taking photographs specifically focused on the mirror, hoping to capture evidence of what I was witnessing. As I reviewed the images on my camera's digital display, I made a discovery that filled me with both fascination and terror. In several of the photographs, the mysterious woman was clearly visible in the mirror's reflection, but she appeared to be staring directly at the camera with an expression of intense sadness and longing. Her face was pale and drawn, and her eyes seemed to convey a deep sense of loss and desperation that was deeply disturbing to observe. Even more unsettling was the fact that in some photographs, the woman appeared to be reaching toward the camera with outstretched hands, as if she was trying to communicate with me or escape from whatever realm she inhabited. Her mouth was open as if she was speaking or crying out, though I heard no sounds during the actual photography session. As I continued reviewing the images, I noticed that the woman's appearance became progressively more distressed and agitated in each successive photograph. Her facial expression changed from sadness to fear, then to what appeared to be terror or panic, as if something was pursuing or threatening her in the reflected world she inhabited. The final photograph in the series showed the woman looking back over her shoulder with an expression of absolute horror, her mouth open in what appeared to be a silent scream. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the reflected room, I could make out the shapes of multiple dark figures approaching her with obvious malicious intent. This last image was so disturbing that I immediately stopped taking photographs and began packing up my equipment as quickly as possible. The atmosphere in the house had changed dramatically, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and urgency that told me I needed to leave the property immediately. As I was carrying my equipment downstairs toward the front door, I heard what sounded like a woman crying somewhere in the upper floors of the house. The sobbing was heartbroken and desperate, filled with a grief so profound that it made my chest ache with sympathy and fear. I paused on the staircase and called out, asking if someone needed help, but the crying stopped immediately and was replaced by complete silence. The sudden cessation of the sounds was somehow more frightening than the crying itself had been, and I quickened my pace toward the exit. When I reached my car and loaded my equipment, I looked back at the house and saw a figure standing in the window of the master bedroom where I had been taking photographs. The woman from the mirror was now visible in the actual window, pressing her hands against the glass and staring down at me with the same expression of desperate pleading that I had captured in my photographs. I drove away from the property as quickly as possible and immediately called the real estate agent to report what I had experienced. To my surprise, she was not shocked by my account and revealed that I was not the first photographer to report supernatural encounters in that house. She explained that the mansion had a tragic history involving a young woman who had died in the master bedroom under mysterious circumstances in 1893. According to local records, the woman had been found dead in front of the fireplace with no apparent cause of death, and witnesses had reported seeing her reflection in mirrors throughout the house for decades after her passing. Despite this disturbing history, The real estate agent still hoped that my photographs would help to market the property to buyers who might be interested in its historic significance rather than deterred by its supernatural reputation. However, when I reviewed my photographs later that evening, I discovered that they contained far more than I had bargained for. The images that showed the woman in the mirror had somehow captured other figures as well, dark shapes and shadows that suggested the presence of multiple supernatural entities within the house. Some photographs showed what appeared to be entire scenes playing out in the reflected world, depicting events that seemed to be connected to the tragic history of the property. I ultimately decided not to provide these photographs to the real estate agent, as I felt that they would be more likely to frighten potential buyers than attract them. Instead, I submitted only the standard architectural images that showed the house's beautiful features without any supernatural elements. The mansion remains unsold to this day, and I have heard from other photographers and contractors that supernatural activity in the house has actually increased in recent months. Some visitors have reported seeing the mysterious woman not just in mirrors and windows, but walking through the actual rooms of the house as if she was still a living resident. My experience at that Victorian mansion fundamentally changed my understanding of what it means to capture reality through photography. It taught me that sometimes our cameras can record things that exist beyond the normal boundaries of our physical world, and that some places hold on to their past in ways that transcend our conventional understanding of time and space. The substitute teacher's discovery. Teaching has always been my passion, and I have spent the last 15 years working as a substitute teacher in various schools throughout my state. This career path has taken me to dozens of different educational institutions, from small rural schools to large urban complexes, and I have generally found the work to be rewarding and fulfilling. However, one particular assignment at Roosevelt Elementary School resulted in an experience that made me seriously consider changing careers entirely. The school had contacted me on a Friday afternoon, asking if I could fill in for a third-grade teacher who had become suddenly ill and would be unable to work the following Monday. Roosevelt Elementary was located in an older part of town, housed in a brick building that had been constructed in the early 1950s. The school had a reputation for academic excellence and was generally considered to be one of the better elementary schools in the district, so I was pleased to accept the assignment. I arrived at the school early Monday morning to familiarize myself with the classroom layout, review the lesson plans left by the regular teacher, and prepare for what I expected to be a normal day of working with 8- and 9-year-old students. The classroom was bright and cheerful, decorated with colorful artwork and educational posters that created a welcoming learning environment. The regular teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had left detailed instructions for the day's activities, including math worksheets, reading assignments, and a science experiment involving the growth of bean plants. Everything seemed well organized and straightforward, and I felt confident that the day would proceed smoothly. The students began arriving around 8:15 in the morning, and they appeared to be well behaved, curious, and eager to learn. They asked polite questions about who I was and why their regular teacher was absent, and they seemed to accept my presence without any significant resistance or behavioral problems. The morning activities proceeded exactly as planned, with the children working diligently on their assignments and participating enthusiastically in class discussions. I was impressed by their maturity and cooperation, and I began to think that this would be one of the easier substitute teaching assignments I had ever undertaken. However, as we were preparing for lunch around 11:30, one of the students, a quiet girl named Emma, approached my desk with a concerned expression on her face. She looked around nervously to make sure that other students were not listening, then whispered, "Miss Johnson, why is there a man standing in the corner of our classroom?" I followed Emma's gaze toward the corner of the room that she was indicating, but I saw only empty space, bookshelves, and educational materials. There was no man present anywhere in the classroom, and I could not understand what had prompted her question. "I don't see anyone in the corner, Emma," I replied gently. "Are you sure you saw something there?" Emma nodded emphatically and pointed more specifically toward the area near the reading corner where several bean plants were growing on a small table near the window. "He's standing right there next to the plants, and he's watching all of us. He looks very sad, and he's wearing old-fashioned clothes like from a long time ago. I looked more carefully at the area Emma had indicated, but I still could not see any person or figure that might have prompted her observation. However, as I continued to scan the corner, I noticed that several other students were also looking in that direction with expressions of curiosity and concern. "Can anyone else see what Emma is talking about?" I asked the class, trying to determine if this was some kind of shared game or imagination exercise. To my surprise, approximately half of the students raised their hands, indicating that they could also see the mysterious man that Emma had described. They began offering additional details about his appearance, mentioning that he wore a brown suit, had grey hair, and appeared to be very old. One student, a boy named Timothy, added, "He comes to our classroom sometimes when we're working on our plant project. Mrs. Henderson told us that he used to be a teacher here a long time ago, and he still likes to watch us learn about growing things." This information was both intriguing and concerning. If Mrs. Henderson was aware of this phenomenon and had discussed it with the students, then perhaps there was some kind of logical explanation that I was not aware of. However, the fact that I could not see this figure myself was deeply unsettling. During the lunch break, I decided to visit the school's main office to inquire about the history of my classroom and any former teachers who might be connected to the space. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was initially hesitant to discuss the topic, but eventually shared some information that explained the students' observations. She told me that the classroom I was working in had previously been occupied by a teacher named Mr. Thomas Whitman, who had taught third grade at Roosevelt Elementary for over 30 years before his retirement in 1988. Mr. Whitman had been beloved by students and colleagues alike, known particularly for his innovative science lessons and his passion for teaching children about plant biology and environmental science. Unfortunately, Mr. Whitman had passed away just 2 years after his retirement, suffering a heart attack while working in his garden at home. According to Mrs. Rodriguez, many students and staff members had reported seeing Mr. Whitman in his former classroom over the years, particularly during science lessons involving plants or gardening activities. "We've learned to accept Mr. Whitman's presence as a positive and benevolent influence," Mrs. Rodriguez explained. "The students who can see him report that he seems happy and interested in their learning, and his presence has never been associated with any negative or frightening experiences." Armed with this information, I returned to my classroom for the afternoon session with a different perspective on what the students had been observing. While I still could not see Mr. Whitman myself, I began to notice subtle changes in the classroom atmosphere during our science activities. The bean plants that the students had been growing seemed to be thriving far beyond what would be expected for their stage of development. The leaves were unusually green and healthy, and the growth rate was significantly faster than normal for that type of plant. Additionally, the students displayed an exceptional level of knowledge and enthusiasm for the scientific concepts we were discussing. As the afternoon progressed, I began to experience a sense of warmth and positive energy in the classroom that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The students seemed more focused, more cooperative, and more engaged with their learning than I had ever observed in any other classroom setting. Near the end of the school day, as we were cleaning up our science materials and preparing for dismissal, Emma approached me again with something in her hand. "Miss Johnson, Mr. Whitman wanted me to give this to you," she said, offering me a small piece of paper. On the paper was written, in elegant handwriting, "Thank you for taking good care of my students today. They are lucky to have such a dedicated substitute teacher." The note was signed T. Whitman in the same careful script. I examined the paper carefully, noting that the handwriting appeared to be from an older generation, with a formal penmanship style that was common in earlier decades. The paper itself felt aged and had a slightly yellowed appearance that suggested it was not recently written. When I asked Emma where she had gotten the note, she explained that Mr. Whitman had placed it on her desk when I was helping other students with their work. She described how he had smiled at her kindly and pointed toward me, indicating that he wanted her to deliver the message. I kept that note as a reminder of one of the most unusual and ultimately positive supernatural experiences I have ever had. While I never saw Mr. Whitman myself, his presence in the classroom was clearly beneficial to the students' learning and development, and his continued dedication to education even after death was both touching and inspiring. The experience taught me that not all supernatural encounters are frightening or malevolent. Sometimes, the spirits of those who have passed away continue to watch over and care for the places and people they loved during their lifetime, providing comfort and guidance in ways that we might not always understand but can certainly appreciate. The night security job. After losing my previous job due to company downsizing, I was desperate to find new employment that would allow me to pay my bills and support my family. When I saw an advertisement for a night security position at an abandoned shopping mall, I immediately applied despite the fact that the job description was somewhat vague, and the pay seemed unusually high for such basic work. The hiring process was surprisingly quick and informal. I met with the property manager, Mr. Harrison, at a coffee shop near the mall, and he explained that my responsibilities would be simple. Patrol the building from 10 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning, ensure that no unauthorized persons gained entry to the property, and report any unusual activities or security concerns. Crescent Valley Mall had been closed to the public for approximately 3 years, but the property was still owned by a development company that was hoping to eventually renovate and reopen the facility. In the meantime, they needed someone to maintain basic security and prevent vandalism, theft, or other criminal activities that often plagued abandoned commercial properties. Mr. Harrison provided me with a set of keys, a flashlight, a two-way radio, and basic instructions about the building's layout and security systems. He mentioned that the electricity had been partially shut off to save money, which meant that most areas of the mall would be dark and would require the use of my flashlight for navigation. The building can feel a little eerie at night, Mr. Harrison warned me, but it's just because of the emptiness and the way sounds echo through the corridors. Don't let your imagination run wild, and you'll do just fine. On my first night, I arrived at the mall at 9:45 to begin my shift with plenty of time to familiarize myself with the property before Mr. Harrison left for the evening. The building was enormous, with over 200 former store locations spread across 2 levels, plus a food court and several anchor department stores that had once been major retail destinations. Walking through the empty mall corridors was indeed an eerie experience, with my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating storefronts that still displayed faded signs and security gates from their operational days. The sound of my footsteps echoed throughout the vast space, creating an almost cathedral-like acoustic effect that was both impressive and unsettling. For the first several hours of my shift, everything proceeded normally. I completed my required patrols, checked all of the exterior doors and windows for signs of forced entry, and settled into the security office to monitor the building through a basic camera system that covered the main entrances. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I began to hear sounds that seemed inconsistent with an empty building. At first, these noises were subtle. The distant sound of what might have been music playing somewhere in the mall, the echo of what could have been footsteps on the upper level, and occasional creaking sounds that might have been the building settling. I decided to investigate these sounds more thoroughly, taking my flashlight and radio as I ventured out into the main corridors of the mall. As I walked toward the area where I thought the music was coming from, the sounds seemed to move ahead of me, always staying just beyond the range of my flashlight beam. The music itself was difficult to describe, but it sounded like the kind of generic background music that had probably played throughout the mall during its operational years. However, there should have been no power to any audio systems, and I could not identify any source for the mysterious sounds. As I continued my investigation, I began to notice other phenomena that were even more disturbing than the unexplained music. In several of the abandoned storefronts, I could see what appeared to be lights flickering behind the security gates, as if the stores were still open and operational despite the fact that the entire mall had been closed for years. When I approached these illuminated storefronts and shined my flashlight through the security gates, I could see what looked like merchandise displayed on shelves and racks. and occasionally I caught glimpses of shadowy figures moving around inside the stores as if they were customers browsing through the available items. But when I tried to get a closer look or take photographs of these mysterious activities, the lights would immediately go out, and the stores would return to their normal state of abandonment and decay. The merchandise displays would vanish, and the shadowy figures would disappear as if they had never been there at all. The most terrifying encounter occurred when I was patrolling the food court area on the upper level of the mall. As I entered the large, open space that had once housed numerous restaurants and fast food establishments, I was shocked to see that many of the food service counters appeared to be fully operational and brightly lit. Steam was rising from what looked like hot food warmers, and I could smell the distinct aromas of various cuisines that had once been served in this location. Behind the counters, I could see figures wearing food service uniforms moving around as if they were preparing meals for customers. As I stood frozen in amazement and terror, one of the uniformed figures noticed my presence and waved at me in a friendly manner. The person appeared to be a middle-aged woman wearing a hairnet and apron, and she called out to me in a cheerful voice, "Would you like to order something, honey? We're still open for a few more minutes." Before I could respond or even fully process what was happening, the entire food court suddenly plunged back into darkness and silence. The cooking smells disappeared, the steam vanished, and the uniformed figures were nowhere to be seen. I was once again alone in an empty, abandoned space that showed no signs of recent activity. I immediately contacted Mr. Harrison using my radio to report these unusual experiences, but I received only static in response. My cell phone showed no signal, despite the fact that I had excellent coverage in this area during normal daytime hours. Feeling increasingly isolated and frightened, I decided to remain in the security office for the rest of my shift rather than continue patrolling the building. From the safety of the office, I monitored the security cameras and tried to document any unusual activities that might appear on the screens. What I observed through the camera system was even more disturbing than what I had witnessed during my personal patrols. The cameras showed the mall corridors filled with translucent figures walking around as if the facility was still open and operational. These ghostly shoppers moved in and out of stores, carried shopping bags, and interacted with each other just as living customers would have done during the mall's heyday. The most unsettling aspect of this spectral shopping activity was that it appeared to be a perfect recreation of the mall's busiest and most successful period, possibly from the 1980s or early 90s, when the facility had been a thriving community gathering place. I remained in the security office until 6 o'clock in the morning, when my replacement was scheduled to arrive. However, when the day security guard showed up for his shift, he seemed surprised to see me still in the building. "I thought you would have quit by now," he said with a knowing smile. "Most new guys don't make it through their first night here. This place has a way of showing people things that make them reconsider whether they really want this job." He went on to explain that the mall had experienced a gradual decline over many years before finally closing, and that several tragic incidents had occurred in the building during its final years of operation. These included a fatal heart attack in the food court, a suicide in one of the department stores, and a shooting incident near the main entrance that had resulted in multiple casualties. According to the day security guard, many people believed that the traumatic events and the deep emotional connections that thousands of people had formed with the mall over the years had created some kind of supernatural imprint that continued to replay itself night after night. "The ghosts aren't dangerous," he assured me. "They're just going about their business the same way they did when they were alive. They're probably not even aware that the mall is closed or that they've passed away. But seeing them can be pretty unsettling if you're not prepared for it." Despite his reassurances, I found it impossible to continue working in an environment where I was constantly surrounded by supernatural activity. I completed only one more week at the job before finding alternative employment at a conventional office building where the only spirits I encountered were my living co-workers. The experience at Crescent Valley Mall taught me that some places retain the energy and memories of their most significant periods, creating temporal echoes that can be observed by those who are sensitive to such phenomena. While these ghostly recreations may not be malevolent or dangerous, they serve as powerful reminders of the emotional significance that certain locations can hold in the lives of the communities they once served. The rideshare passenger. Working as a rideshare driver has given me the opportunity to meet hundreds of interesting people and hear countless fascinating stories from passengers representing all walks of life. Most of these encounters are pleasant and routine, involving friendly conversation during relatively short trips around the city where I work. However, one particular passenger pickup resulted in an experience that was so disturbing and inexplicable that it made me seriously consider finding a different line of work entirely. This incident occurred on a rainy Thursday night in October, during what had otherwise been a completely normal evening of driving for the rideshare platform. I had received a pickup request for a passenger named Jennifer who needed transportation from a residential address to a location across town. The pickup address was in a well-established neighborhood that I was familiar with, and the destination was a popular restaurant district where I had dropped off many passengers in the past. When I arrived at the pickup location, I found myself in front of a modest two-story house with a well-maintained front yard and no obvious signs of anything unusual or concerning. I sent the standard text message to notify the passenger of my arrival and waited in my car for her to come outside. After waiting for approximately 5 minutes without seeing any activity from the house, I decided to call the passenger's phone number to let her know that I was ready to begin the trip. The phone rang several times before being answered by a woman with a soft, pleasant voice who apologized for the delay and assured me that she would be outside momentarily. A few minutes later, I saw a young woman emerge from the front door of the house and walk toward my car. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with long brown hair and wearing a dark coat that was appropriate for the rainy weather. She seemed completely normal and unremarkable, the kind of passenger I transported dozens of times each week. Jennifer opened the rear passenger door and settled into the back seat, greeting me politely and confirming the destination address that appeared on my rideshare app. She seemed friendly but quiet, which was not unusual for passengers who preferred to use the travel time for personal reflection or mobile phone activities. As I began driving toward the restaurant district, I attempted to make pleasant conversation by asking about her evening plans and commenting on the weather. Jennifer responded appropriately but briefly, giving no indication that anything was wrong or unusual about her situation. However, as we continued driving through the city, I began to notice something very strange about my passenger's reflection in my rearview mirror. While I could clearly see Jennifer sitting in the back seat when I turned around to look at her directly, her image did not appear in any of my mirrors. At first, I thought this might be due to the angle of the mirrors or some kind of optical illusion caused by the rain and streetlights. I adjusted my rearview mirror several times and checked my side mirrors as well, but Jennifer's reflection remained completely absent from all reflective surfaces in the car. This phenomenon was so unusual and unsettling that I began to feel genuinely frightened, though I tried to maintain my composure and continue driving normally. I had never experienced anything like this before, and I could not think of any rational explanation for why someone would cast no reflection. As we approached a red traffic light, I decided to turn around and look directly at Jennifer to confirm that she was still present in my vehicle. When I looked into the back seat, I was shocked to discover that it was completely empty. Jennifer had vanished entirely, leaving no trace of her presence except for a slight depression in the seat cushion where she had been sitting. Confused and alarmed, I pulled over to the side of the road and thoroughly searched my entire vehicle, checking the floor, under the seats, and anywhere else a person might possibly hide. Jennifer was simply gone, as if she had never been in my car at all. I checked my rideshare app to see if there had been any updates or cancellations from the passenger, but the trip was still showing as active and in progress. According to the app, Jennifer should still be in my car, and I was expected to deliver her to the requested destination. Not knowing what else to do, I decided to drive to the destination address and see if Jennifer might be waiting there, though I could not imagine how she could have arrived ahead of me. When I reached the restaurant district, I found no sign of her anywhere in the vicinity. I attempted to call Jennifer's phone number to report the situation and find out what had happened, but the number was no longer in service. The automated message indicated that the phone number I was trying to reach had been disconnected or was no longer valid. Increasingly concerned that something serious might have happened to my passenger, I contacted the rideshare company's emergency support line to report the incident. The customer service representative who handled my call seemed confused by my account and assured me that they would investigate the situation and contact me with any updates. The following day, I received a call from the rideshare company informing me that there was no record of any passenger named Jennifer having requested a ride from my vehicle the previous night. According to their system, I had been offline and unavailable during the time period when I believed I had been driving her across town. Even more disturbing was the revelation that the pickup address I had driven to was the site of a house that had been destroyed in a fire several months earlier. The property was currently an empty lot with no structures or residents, making it impossible for anyone to have requested a pickup from that location. The customer service representative suggested that I might have experienced some kind of technical glitch with the app, or possibly fallen asleep while driving and dreamed the entire encounter. However, I knew with absolute certainty that what I had experienced was real, and not a product of my imagination or a technological malfunction. I conducted my own research into the history of the pickup address, and discovered that a young woman named Jennifer Morrison had indeed lived at that location before the house fire. She had tragically died in the blaze, along with her 2 young children, when a faulty electrical system had caused the fire to spread faster than they could escape. The realization that I had somehow been contacted by and transported the spirit of someone who had died months earlier filled me with a combination of terror and profound sadness. I began to understand that Jennifer might have been trying to complete one final journey, perhaps to a place that held special significance for her during her lifetime. I never received another rideshare request from that address, and I have since changed my driver settings to avoid pickups from that specific neighborhood. The experience left me with a deep respect for the mysteries that exist beyond our understanding of life and death, and a recognition that sometimes the most ordinary activities can become gateways to extraordinary encounters with the supernatural world. The library's secret. As the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library, I had always prided myself on creating a welcoming and peaceful environment where community members could pursue learning, research, and personal enrichment. The library had been my professional home for over 12 years, and I thought I knew every corner, every book, and every aspect of the building's character and history. However, during renovation work that was conducted last summer, workers made a discovery that revealed a dark secret that had been hidden within the library's walls for decades. This discovery would ultimately lead to a series of supernatural encounters that changed my understanding of the building I had devoted so much of my professional life to maintaining and protecting. The renovation project was intended to update the library's electrical systems, improve accessibility features, and create additional space for community programming. During the demolition phase, construction workers were removing a section of wall in the basement storage area when they uncovered a hidden room that was not shown on any of the building's architectural plans or historical records. The secret room was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet in size, with no windows, no ventilation, and no apparent purpose that could be determined from its construction. The space was completely empty except for scratch marks on the walls that appeared to have been made by human fingernails, and several pieces of children's clothing that had been left scattered on the floor. When the construction supervisor contacted me about this discovery, I immediately called the police to report the finding and request an investigation into the room's history and purpose. The responding officers treated the situation very seriously, as the evidence suggested that the hidden space might have been used for criminal purposes involving children. A forensic investigation of the secret room revealed additional disturbing details. Analysis of the scratch marks on the walls indicated that they had been made over an extended period of time, suggesting that someone had been confined in the space for days or possibly weeks. The children's clothing showed signs of prolonged wear and contained DNA evidence that could potentially be used to identify victims. Most horrifying of all, investigators found human remains buried beneath the concrete floor of the hidden room. The skeletal remains appeared to belong to 3 children, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 12 years old. Carbon dating and other forensic techniques suggested that these children had died sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s. The discovery of these remains transformed what had been a routine renovation project into a major criminal investigation. The police began reviewing missing person reports from the relevant time period, trying to identify the victims and determine who might have been responsible for their deaths. During the investigation, I learned disturbing information about the library's history that had never been documented in any official records. According to longtime community members, there had been persistent rumors for decades about children disappearing from the library during after-school hours, but these reports had never been taken seriously by authorities. Several elderly residents recalled stories about a former library employee who had worked in the building during the 1970s and had been known for his unusual interest in spending time alone with young library patrons. This individual, whose name was Robert Chen, had left his position abruptly in 1981, and no one in the community had maintained contact with him after his departure. As the police investigation continued, I began to experience supernatural phenomena in the library that seemed to be connected to the discovery of the hidden room and the children's remains. These experiences started subtly, but gradually became more frequent and more intense as the weeks passed. I would arrive at work in the morning to find children's books scattered across the floor in areas that had been clean and organized when I had left the previous evening. The books were always titles that had been popular during the 1970s and 80s, and they were often open to pages depicting children in dangerous or frightening situations. On several occasions, I heard the sounds of children laughing and playing somewhere in the library during hours when the building was supposed to be empty. These sounds seemed to come from the basement area where the hidden room had been discovered, but when I investigated, I always found the space completely deserted. The most unsettling experiences occurred during the evening hours when I was working alone to complete administrative tasks after the library had closed to the public. I would frequently see the shadowy figures of small children moving between the book stacks, but when I tried to approach them or offer assistance, they would vanish immediately. One particularly memorable evening, I was working late in my office when I heard the distinct sound of children whispering in the main reading area. The whispers were urgent and frightened, as if the children were trying to warn me about some kind of danger or threat. When I left my office to investigate, I found 3 translucent figures of children standing near the circulation desk. They appeared to be the same ages as the remains that had been found in the hidden room, and their expressions conveyed a mixture of sadness, fear, and desperate hope. The oldest child, a girl who appeared to be around 12 years old, looked directly at me and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Please help us find our way home. We've been lost in this place for so long, and we're scared and want to see our families again." Before I could respond, the 3 children began to fade away, becoming more and more transparent until they disappeared entirely. The experience left me emotionally shaken and filled with a profound sense of responsibility to somehow help these trapped spirits find peace. I contacted a local paranormal investigator who specialized in helping earthbound spirits transition to whatever comes after death. Working together, we conducted a ceremony in the basement area designed to acknowledge the children's suffering and provide them with guidance for moving on to their next existence. Since that ceremony was performed, the supernatural activity in the library has decreased significantly, though I still occasionally sense the presence of the children during quiet moments in the building. Rather than feeling frightened by these experiences, I now view them as reminders of the importance of protecting vulnerable members of our community and ensuring that those who cannot speak for themselves are not forgotten. The criminal investigation into Robert Chen and the deaths of the 3 children remains ongoing, though Chen himself died several years ago, making prosecution impossible. However, the case has brought closure to several families whose children disappeared during that time period, and it has prompted changes in library safety protocols to ensure that such tragedies can never happen again. The hidden room has been permanently sealed, and a small memorial garden has been created outside the library to honor the memory of the 3 children whose lives were cut short in such a tragic manner. While the supernatural activity has largely ceased, the library will forever carry the weight of this dark chapter in its history. The overnight hotel guest. Working the night shift at the front desk of the Grand Oak Hotel had always been a peaceful and relatively easy job that allowed me to earn a steady income while pursuing my degree in hospitality management. The hotel was a small, family-owned establishment with only 35 rooms, and overnight guests were typically quiet business travelers or tourists who simply wanted a comfortable place to rest. This particular incident occurred during a slow Tuesday night in November, when the hotel had only 6 occupied rooms, and I was the only staff member on duty. The quiet atmosphere was exactly what I preferred for night shift work, as it allowed me to focus on my studies while monitoring the front desk and handling any guest requests that might arise. Around 2:15 in the morning, I was reviewing course materials for an upcoming exam when the lobby elevator made its distinctive dinging sound, indicating that someone was coming down from one of the upper floors. This was unusual but not unprecedented, as occasionally guests would venture to the lobby during overnight hours to request additional towels, ask for directions, or use the business center computers. As the elevator doors opened, I looked up from my textbooks and saw an elderly gentleman step into the lobby. He was impeccably dressed in a 3-piece suit that appeared to be from several decades earlier, complete with a pocket watch chain and a formal hat that few people wear in modern times. His appearance was so distinctive and old-fashioned that he immediately caught my attention. The gentleman approached the front desk with slow, deliberate steps, and I noticed that his footsteps made no sound on the marble floor of the lobby. This struck me as odd, as dress shoes typically create at least some noise when walking on hard surfaces, especially in the acoustically enhanced environment of the hotel lobby. "Good evening, young man," the elderly gentleman said in a voice that was cultured and polite, but seemed to carry an unusual echo, as if he was speaking from inside a large, empty room. "I am checking out of room 212, and I wanted to settle my account before departing." I immediately consulted my computer system to look up the guest registration for room 212, but according to our records, that room was currently vacant and had been empty for the past 3 days. I double-checked the information to make sure I had not made an error, but the computer clearly showed no current guest assigned to that room. "I'm sorry, sir, but our system shows that room 212 is not currently occupied," I explained politely. "Perhaps there has been some confusion about your room number? Could you please provide me with your name so I can locate your reservation?" The elderly gentleman looked at me with an expression of mild confusion and concern. "My name is Charles Wellington, and I have been staying in room 212 for the past several days. I made my reservation well in advance, and I have been very satisfied with the accommodations and service. I searched our guest database thoroughly for any reservation under the name Charles Wellington, checking not only current registrations but also recent checkouts and future bookings. However, I could find no record of anyone by that name having stayed at our hotel recently or having any upcoming reservations. Mr. Wellington, I'm having difficulty locating your reservation in our system," I said, trying to maintain a professional tone while dealing with this increasingly confusing situation. "Would it be possible for you to show me your room key or any confirmation documents you might have?" The gentleman reached into his jacket pocket and produced an old-fashioned brass key attached to a leather key fob marked with the number 212. The key was unlike anything used in our hotel, as we had converted to electronic card keys several years earlier, and I had never seen brass keys like this one anywhere in the building. "This is the key that your staff provided to me when I checked in," Mr. Wellington explained, placing the antique key on the front desk counter. "I have been using it to access my room without any problems during my stay." I picked up the brass key and examined it carefully. The metal was tarnished with age, and the key fob showed signs of extensive use over many years. The craftsmanship was clearly from an earlier era, possibly the 1940s or 50s when the hotel had first opened. "Mr. Wellington, I need to verify something," I said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Would you mind if I accompanied you to room 212 to check on the status of the room?" The elderly gentleman agreed to this suggestion, and we walked together toward the elevator. As we waited for the elevator to arrive, I noticed that Mr. Wellington's reflection was not visible in the polished metal doors, just as my rideshare passenger Jennifer had cast no reflection in my car mirrors. When we reached the second floor and walked to room 212, I used my master key card to open the door, revealing a completely vacant room that showed no signs of recent occupancy. The bed was perfectly made with fresh linens, the bathroom was spotless, and there were no personal belongings or evidence that anyone had been staying in the room. Mr. Wellington looked around the empty room with an expression of profound confusion and distress. "I don't understand," he said, his voice beginning to waver with emotion. "This is my room. My suitcase was on the bed, my clothes were in the closet, and my toiletries were in the bathroom. Everything is gone." As he spoke these words, tears began to form in his eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and compassion for this confused elderly man. However, I was also becoming increasingly frightened by the supernatural implications of what I was witnessing. "Mr. Wellington," I said gently, "I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding about your reservation. Let me check with our management company to see if we can resolve this situation." As I was speaking, Mr. Wellington slowly turned to face me, and I could see that his appearance was beginning to change. His face was becoming more pale and translucent, and his clothing seemed to be fading as if it were losing substance and solidity. "Thank you for your kindness, young man," he said, his voice now sounding very distant and ethereal. "I think I understand now. I have been trying to check out for much longer than I realized. It is time for me to go home." With these words, Mr. Wellington began to fade away completely, becoming more and more transparent until he disappeared entirely. The brass key that he had placed on the front desk counter vanished along with him, leaving no physical evidence of our encounter. I stood alone in the empty hotel room, trying to process what I had just witnessed and determine whether I should report this incident to anyone. The rational part of my mind suggested that I had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue and the stress of working overnight shifts. However, when I returned to the front desk and reviewed the hotel's historical records, I made a discovery that confirmed the reality of my supernatural encounter. Charles Wellington had indeed been a guest at the Grand Oak Hotel, but his stay had occurred in 1957, and he had died of a heart attack in room 212 during what was supposed to be his final night at the hotel. According to the records, Mr. Wellington had been a traveling salesman who had stayed at the hotel regularly during business trips to our city. On his final visit, he had suffered a fatal heart attack in his sleep and had been discovered by housekeeping staff the following morning. He had never had the opportunity to formally check out of the hotel, as his death had occurred just hours before his planned departure. The realization that I had helped a spirit complete his long overdue checkout process filled me with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. While the encounter had been frightening, I felt honored to have played a role in helping Mr. Wellington find the peace and closure that had eluded him for over 60 years. I continued working at the Grand Oak Hotel for several more months, but I never experienced another supernatural encounter like the one with Mr. Wellington. The incident taught me that sometimes the spirits of those who have passed away become trapped by unfinished business or unresolved emotions, and that helping them find closure can be both a privilege and a responsibility for the living. The hotel management eventually learned about my encounter with Mr. Wellington, and rather than being concerned or skeptical, they were actually pleased that someone had finally helped him complete his journey. They explained that several other night shift employees had reported seeing an elderly gentleman in old-fashioned clothing over the years, but no one had ever been able to communicate with him as successfully as I had. The brass key that Mr. Wellington had shown me was later found in the hotel's historical archives, along with records of his original stay and the tragic circumstances of his death. The key is now displayed in a small memorial case in the hotel lobby, serving as a tribute to a loyal guest who finally found his way home after more than 6 decades of waiting. These 10 stories represent just a small sampling of the countless supernatural encounters that occur in our world every day. experienced by ordinary people in ordinary situations who find themselves confronting extraordinary phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, life, and death. Each story serves as a reminder that the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds is far more porous than most of us realize, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries reveal themselves in the most unexpected moments and places. Whether these experiences represent genuine contact with spirits of the deceased, glimpses into parallel dimensions, or manifestations of psychological and emotional energies that we do not yet understand, they all share common themes of human connection, unfinished business, and the powerful ways that love, loss, and memory can transcend the limitations of physical existence. For those who have experienced such encounters, the impact is often life-changing, providing new perspectives on mortality, consciousness, and the interconnected nature of all human experience. While these stories may frighten some readers, they also offer hope that death is not the end of existence, but rather a transition to something beyond our current understanding. The individuals who have shared these accounts demonstrate tremendous courage in reliving traumatic experiences and opening themselves to potential skepticism or disbelief from others. Their willingness to document and share these encounters contributes to our collective understanding of phenomena that science has not yet been able to fully explain or comprehend. As we continue to explore the mysteries of consciousness, memory, and the nature of existence itself, these personal accounts of supernatural encounters provide valuable insights into experiences that may be far more common than most people realize. They remind us to remain open to possibilities that extend beyond our conventional understanding of reality, and to approach the unknown with both healthy skepticism and genuine curiosity. These stories also emphasize the importance of treating all encounters with the supernatural world with respect, compassion, and understanding. Whether we are dealing with the spirits of those who have passed away or confronting other forms of paranormal activity, our response should be guided by empathy rather than fear, and by a recognition that these experiences often represent opportunities for healing, closure, and spiritual growth. In the end, these true horror stories serve not only as entertainment, but as windows into the profound mysteries that surround us every day. They challenge us to expand our understanding of what is possible, to question our assumptions about the nature of reality, and to remain open to the extraordinary experiences that can transform ordinary moments into life-changing encounters with the unknown. The legacy of these stories lies not in the fear they generate, but in their capacity to inspire wonder, promote empathy, and encourage us to approach the mysteries of existence with courage, curiosity, and an appreciation for the countless ways that the supernatural world continues to intersect with our daily lives in unexpected and meaningful ways.